structure for today is going to be a little bit different from the workshop structure from yesterday. Instead of doing a full lecture followed by a full video followed by panel discussions, what I'm going to be doing are mini lectures followed by playing you chunks of a video that we will then analyze together. This means that it does kind of require your cooperation, meaning you must be willing to turn on your microphone and offer your thoughts freely. Again, if you're worried about recordings, feel free to leave your camera off. If you are extra worried and you don't want to consent to your discussions being filmed, once again, please message us and we'll try to cut your section out of the discussion. Okay. So please let me just give a quick overview of what I think I want to cover today, and then we will begin. Yesterday, you guys pretty much covered the idea that the team that wins debates is the team that most persuades an average reasonable voter through making logical and relevant arguments. And then you went through some mechanisms for determining which arguments a team made. You went through different motion types and you went through the speaker scale. Today, I want to go a little bit more in depth into this, and I want to actually unpack how we judge analysis, how we weigh competing issues against each other, and some common mistakes I usually see when people are judging. So the first thing I want to go through is analysis and judging opening government. The second thing I'm going to go through is how to judge where you believe that there is late material in the deputy leader of opposition. The third thing I'm going to go through is extensions. The fourth thing I'm going to look at is going to be whip speeches. And then last of all, I'm going to look at principled and practical arguments and then do some explanation for how to judge the diagonal. Again, all of this is going to be interspersed at various points by video. So if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to just pause and ask. If you're going to pause and ask, I would ask that you just unmute yourself and ask a question rather than type in the chat, because I find it confusing to look at both the chat and the video and everything else at the same time. So thanks very much. Please feel free to ask questions. I think every discussion is richer when we have quite a number of participants in it. Okay. So if everyone is all right so far, I'm going to just start on talking about analysis and what I think Opening Gov does and what Opening Gov is frequently undercredited with. Generally, when judging, we look at two things. We look at analysis, which is basically how well something is proven, and then we look at significance, meaning is the argument that was proven actually important and relevant to the round? I could give you the most beautifully analyzed 7 minutes for why something is my favorite TV show in the world, but unless it shows a direct relevance and importance to the round, that analysis is probably, unfortunately, not going to count for a huge amount within the debate itself. Okay, so what exactly do I mean by analysis? The first thing I want to make extremely clear to everybody is that analysis is not always explicit, meaning that teams will not always tell you, I am going to start my first point of substantive material, or I am going to analyze this issue for you. But as judges, we must still be prepared to credit this analysis wherever we see it, even if it is implicit and it is not flagged as analysis. So here are some things that I think need to be credited, or you need to look out for these things, even if teams don't explicitly flag for analysis. I think first of all, the most obvious thing, right? To give you reasons to think why a particular action is necessary or reasons to think why a particular action is good. That's something that's very obvious. Even if teams don't explicitly say it's analysis, judges tend to reward this as analysis anyway. The second one, I think, is also quite obvious, which is providing mechanistic or causal links to why a certain outcome is going to come about. Again, we see this as analysis because we're very used to telling teams that they must map step by step their outcome. Third of all, presenting empirical evidence for an argument to be true. Not as strong in terms of analysis, but if you are able to show using empirical evidence that is likely that your outcome is going to come about, that is also something that strengthens your argument and should be credited. If you identify moral intuitions in favor of an argument, if you just say something as simple like, we would generally as a society condemn this kind of action, and you provide some reasons why you think that might be true, we would count that as analysis as well. And I'll go into that in a little bit more depth when it is time to discuss principled versus practical arguments. But the things that are not always explicit are things like setting up the debate, things like characterizations that end up being weaponized as argumentation and end up being quite favorable for your side, or providing explanations of the significance of your impact. All of that stuff also counts in as analysis, and you should be prepared to credit it. Okay, do you credit things if people just give you reasons and that they don't tell you anything and they just say, well, here is analysis, I should automatically win? The word automatic probably gives it away. The answer is no. Reasons themselves may be stronger or weaker based on a couple of things, right? If the speaker is precise and specific and detailed, they are going to be stronger than if a speaker was extremely vague and fluffy. If a speaker is able to provide explanations that are highly analyzed, they're going to be much more persuasive than a speaker who gives you the tagline of an argument and expects you to fill it in for them. So specificity and analysis should be looked at, not just whether or not they provide a single reason or a single headline for what they're going to say. You don't credit just because they claim they have a reason. Actually look at how well that reason was built for them. Okay, so how do you credit analysis? Don't credit individual lines of argument, credit the analysis as a whole. The reason why you don't credit individual lines of argument as well as analysis is because you will then end up double counting, because the argumentation itself has already built up to the analysis overall, which you are crediting. You cannot then credit them extra for also having well-built individual lines of arguments. Okay, so it might be useful here to just flag a quick note that obviously analysis is vulnerable to attacks by rebuttals, and you should also evaluate what happens when the rebuttals are made. So before I go into rebuttals, I want to just give some quick comments about evaluating opening government and some common mistakes I usually see when evaluating opening government. And then I'm going to open up to questions from everybody, okay? So two common mistakes that I usually see when people are evaluating opening government. The first common mistake is that I think judges tend to undercredit material brought by opening government in comparison to material brought by other teams, meaning that things like setting up the debate is commonly seen to have very little value when coming from Prime Minister, because we expect Prime Minister to set up the debate well. And when they do it well, we take it for granted that they should have done it well anyway, so we are less willing to credit them. Whereas we are more likely, I think, to credit the leader of opposition when the leader of opposition does a setup, because we think that, oh, maybe this isn't entirely the role of leader of opposition, LO should probably be credited more. This is wrong. Setup and characterization needs to be credited equally for both teams. In the same way that you will credit opening opposition for setting up a debate or for providing a policy or a framework, you must credit opening government for the same things as well. Note what I'm not saying. I'm not saying that setting up the debate well means you will do well in the debate. It is a necessary but not sufficient condition. If you don't set up the debate well, your case is likely to be fairly unpersuasive, and that might harm you in the rest of the debate. But if you set up the debate well, the rest of your case could still be unpersuasive. It is just that this is a thing that you need to look at when you are crediting teams when they are building their cases. Okay, I'm not saying it has no value at all. I'm just saying it's not a thing that will automatically win you the debate, because there is nothing that automatically wins you the debate. The second common mistake I see from opening government is that teams tend to ignore their analysis, and I sometimes hear judges saying, well, you know, they kind of dropped out of the round. I don't think their arguments had staying power or some other way to explain that the other teams didn't deal with them and just left OG like hanging in the wind. So other teams ignoring arguments does not make the arguments weaker. And other teams not rebutting your arguments doesn't make your arguments any weaker because they didn't rebut them. If they don't rebut your argument, they just kind of stay at the same strength. admittedly, maybe they weren't rebutting your arguments because they made a strategic decision that your arguments were weak and therefore they didn't want to spend that much time on them. But ignoring them doesn't make them extra weak. It just leaves them at the same level they were before, and because no response was made. Okay, what I'm going to do next, okay, is I'm going to show a video of a PM speech, and together we're going to pick out analysis within it, and we're going to talk about what we're crediting to this Prime Minister's speech. Before I do that, okay, I want to open up to the floor to take any questions. Contributions are nice, so it doesn't feel like I'm screaming into a void.
Hi, is it going to be streamed or are we watching it on YouTube? Because yesterday the stream was a bit choppy.
Yeah, I think we fixed the sound. We did some testing yesterday, so hopefully it should be streamed.
Enting, on the analysis, right? So when there's a situation where a particular piece of setup or analysis fits into multiple things that are said later, but the team doesn't draw the link to between that piece of setup, for example, and the argument that they make later. Am I being fair in saying that this argument may sound defeated because other things existed in the speech? Therefore, I can weigh it up. Okay.
Yes. I think you're being absolutely fair. As a judge, sometimes you do have situations where teams are unable to respond to each other. So in the case of a long diagonal, for instance, you would need to, as a judge, look at what was said in things like setup and characterization and arguments and see how they interact with the arguments that happened later on in the round. It is reasonable to expect that teams that are responding should have noticed this bit that was already said in the speech. Great questions. Okay, any more questions before I attempt to do technology things?
So basically, does that mean that we can draw links? So when, for example, the closing is not taking any POIs and things, and we know that there's something in the OG case which directly rebuts their analysis or something, can we make the links for the OG at that point?
Yes, but only to a certain extent. Meaning, you cannot turn OG's claim into an argument they did not make. What you have on your paper, like exactly what they said, take that as their response to the closing opposition. We'll talk a little bit more about long diagonals and comparing teams that are unable to respond later. But for now, just take it as, yes, draw those links, but do not make arguments where arguments were not made. Is that okay?
Yes, thanks.
Okay, fantastic. Actually, excellent question so far. This is super helpful, guys. All right, any more questions? Okay, if no more questions for now, I'm going to try to play a thing, okay? Okay, can people see this quite nice disclaimer? Just unmute yourselves and say yes or something. This is very important. Speakers were given specific directives for this round, meaning we told them that they had to do specific things with their speech. You might realize that this means that their speech sometimes does odd things that we would not expect. Please note that they were given these specific directives, and so they're not necessarily indicative of the speaker's actual beliefs, and they are not indicative of strategies they would normally employ while debating. Maybe if you saw these speakers in an actual round, they would not do these things, okay? So please have pen and paper ready or a laptop so you can take notes. We're going to be watching the Prime Minister's speech. Okay, this is the motion, okay? I'm just gonna pause here so people can take down the motion real quick. Okay, so while I'm screen sharing, I literally just cannot see the chat. So if anyone needs more time, they need to voice it out now before I continue. These are our speakers for the debate. We are extremely grateful to them.
Executed by.
So just a quick side note, the words that are missing from the start of the Prime Minister's speech are, in status quo, policy is primarily executed by. Repeat, in status quo, policy is primarily executed by. And then I'm just going to play the rest of the Prime Minister's speech. Policy is commonly executed by in status quo.
Bloated civil servants and services that use incomplete data sets to make ad hoc judgments about policy issues and priorities. We think it's a problem that is easily solved by using current technologies that allow us to overcome these existing issues and to find solutions to the wicked problems that confront policymakers on a day-to-day basis. So we have 4 points of setup in this debate. First, what will these models actually look like? With regards to the data, we're talking about a few things. We're talking about surveys that are done to collect specific pieces of information about individuals that use the healthcare sector, for instance, or healthcare services. We're talking about censuses, which are broad-based surveys of the whole population regarding a number of issues relating to demography and identification of religion and those sorts of things. We're also talking about redacted information that is often depersonalized regarding things like your health data, regarding things such as recidivism or the rates of incarceration of particular groups. With regards to the analysis of this information, we're talking about often artificial intelligence that is required and used in order to assess and move through large amounts of information. We're talking about algorithms that are constructed to find certain pieces of information, to find correlations and associations and patterns in data, and that is essentially the priority. It is to sieve through a large amount of information and distill it into specific recommendations or pieces of information. What issues are we talking about specifically as a second point of setup? We're talking about most of what is mentioned on the info slide, whether it be issues of planning, issues of tackling longer term problems. It's not about backward looking sort of issues. We're talking about forward looking policy priorities. Thirdly, on the issue of privacy, we think there are a few reasons why this is unlikely to be a significant concern in this debate. The first is that there's a huge amount of data, which means largely it is deliberately anonymized and it's based on associations between different characteristics rather than you know, Joe Blogs did this particular thing. It is always about the abstract features or characteristics of particular individuals. Secondly, this data is almost always already in the public domain. What we're discussing is the way in which that data is used by predictive algorithms to form certain assumptions or recommendations. Secondly, even if that breach occurs and there are some sort of leakages of data, that is unlikely to be anything that the NSA, for instance, doesn't already know with sweeping counterterrorism laws that exist in most countries. Even if that is not the case, we think that it is more important to prioritize the concerns of human security, which is to say the interest of individuals being safe and happy and having a high quality of life, and the specific abstract norm or principle of privacy in this instance, and I'll explain why in this speech. Final issue of setup, with regards to funding and research, we are likely to obviously rely on academic institutions and other individuals to provide these sorts of models, and we are more than willing to invest in those services in order to create the kind of models that can form these predictive algorithms and situations and methodologies. So, on a matter of weighing, what are we wanting to do in this debate? We're wanting to optimize public policy and rectify existing inefficiencies under the status quo. The reason we want to do this is these issues, and this is my first question of why we're improving public policy making in general, these issues are often what is known as wicked problems. This means they're problems that are incredibly complex and different to solve. No, thank you, but incredibly important. They're issues that have huge social consequences, whether it be the way in which housing policy can lock people out of access to homes, whether it be the way in which allocating funding in healthcare sectors can mean that one person dies of cancer while the other does not, the way in which criminal justice policy can strip you of your agency for a long period of time. In that context, why is predictive modeling a far better approach, and why is it something we should dramatically increase in the policymaking process? The first thing, the fact that it can analyze trends and form extrapolations, which means it's far more likely to be proactive to the degree that it is likely to understand the macro causal effects of certain phenomenon rather than being tied to the specific situations or experiences of a particular group at a particular point in time, which is one of the most fundamental cognitive biases that exist in human beings, which is a bias towards the present, a bias towards current experiences, rather than analyzing the broader trends across society that everyone else experiences. Secondly, it can quite frankly deal with a lot of data. It can do so comparatively far more than a civil servant who is looking at a computer. And apologies for any debaters who are civil servants or aspiring civil servants, but frankly, they're both largely incompetent and even if not incompetent, biased in a variety of different ways. And this is very, very different to an algorithm or to a machine such as an artificial intelligence kind of operation, which can assess huge amounts of data in a very efficient way without needing 9 to 5 working hours or coffee breaks 3 times a day. Third of all, it's impersonal, which is to say that these models do not have feelings and they do not have particular associations with different groups. And they may say, and after this I'll take up here why, well, these models can be biased in a few different ways. For instance, they may uncover that African Americans commit more crime in certain areas. A few responses. Firstly, these sort of issues are tied to the specific outcomes that are caused, which is to say that the reason biases may form in an AI is because certain patterns are observed, not that these social norms are ascribed onto a particular behavior, which means they're likely to remove a large chunk of pre-existing bias. For instance, that people think African Americans may be more aggressive, even if in many situations they don't commit the crime on the level people think. So we're saying it will actually be a lower level of bias than you'd expect. Secondly, even when that bias occurs, it's likely to firstly be related to long-term trends that will uncover the causes of these sorts of problems and show why society is often accountable, not the individuals. But even if that wasn't true, it's likely to mean that there won't be direct accountability or causality on that particular group.
What kind of realistic information do you expect from surveys that are going to help meaningfully with police deployment?
No, so the idea is that you can get information about the way you interact with these particular services. You might get and surveys is probably a bad example for that particular area of policy making. So it'd be more relevant for healthcare services and understanding and optimizing how effective they are dealing with consumers. With regards to policing, it's probably looking at stuff like where are the highest rates of crime? How should we then allocate police officers in a way it's much likely to be far fairer and far more reflective of where crime actually is, rather than issues regarding, where do I think crime is most prominent? And that is the comparative in this debate as well. Neg may say, well, this could be biased or discriminatory in some way, but you have to compare that to the kind of individuals that run these departments generally who are likely to have far stronger biases. The final point I make in this speech is it's likely to be far more efficient because these machines don't need upkeep, they don't need a wage, they're incredibly cheap. What it means is you're likely to save a huge amount of money in administering policies generally. That is money you can free up to spend on other social services, but it's also money that is going to be spent better in the sense you are unlikely to need to privatize those kind of services and you can have a better functioning bureaucracy, which Tutor will expand upon at Deputy. That is why I am proud to propose. Thank you.
Okay, so I think everybody was able to listen to the speech. What I'm going to ask people to do now is to take about 2 minutes to look over their notes from the PM speech and pick out bits that you think you are going to credit the PM speech with. So we just went through analysis, and this is going to be pretty simple for most of you because you already also did the judging workshop yesterday, and looking at the names here, I think you guys have definitely judged before as well. So just pick out the bits that you think need to be credited from the PM speech, do a neat little summary at the end of your notes, and then we'll run through them in a second. Okay, just starting up another screen share so I can collate notes from everyone. As a side note, I often find it very helpful to do these kinds of tables when I'm judging. So I'm always noting down arguments and analysis as they occurred, and it really helps in doing quick calls like, okay, who do I think won the top half before the back half starts, in between speeches while speakers are still getting ready to speak. I think it really helps in making things a little bit more structured and clear, especially when you have only a quite short period of time to do a panel discussion in a large tournament. So this is something that may or may not be helpful for you. I know different people have different judge note-taking strategies, so only use this if you think it's going to be helpful in any sense. So this has been, I think, about 2 minutes. Could I just get people to start chiming in with what they think OG's speech did? Unmute yourself and just speak because I can't see the chat.
They first of all set up a debate describing how the policy would work, and also describe how the policy would work using surveys and AI algorithm.
Okay, so they set up the debate. They said the policy would be use surveys. Is saying, if I just gave you the single line in isolation, the policy is going to use surveys. Do you credit that as analysis or no?
No, unless it's linked to some conclusions.
Yeah, this I think is just a description of the setup. So remember what I said about crediting things. You do want them to be at least somewhat explained, and when you are thinking about what to credit to teams, it is often helpful to consider what exactly they did rather than just say they set up a policy. So what did they set up? And again, this is open to anybody who wants to respond.
So I think the mechanism that they set up is quite clear, in that they're talking about how censuses and surveys are going to be conducted. They talk about like AI and algorithms and like various points of setup, but this setup is divorced from like a status quo or a broader context as to like why we're having the debate, and they fail to problematize the motion in a way that like can ground their argument.
Okay, who wants to respond to that? In case people can't see the screen and also didn't catch the question, this particular person has just said that the Prime Minister's speech has not problematized the debate, meaning they did not identify a problem within status quo that they're trying to solve.
He totally did. He told us that, you know, there's human bias, that people are affected by their experiences and also like their training and what has happened to them in their career experience that causes them to, like, for example, policemen thinking that black people are more dangerous because like their own personal experience on the streets, and also because of their police training as well, which we clearly see past few days.
Okay, be careful not to bring in things that weren't directly in the speech, right? Okay, so human bias. Can anybody identify what specific cognitive biases that he listed as well? Because it wasn't just human bias.
Ad hoc judgment.
Could you explain that?
He mentioned it, but he didn't like explain it to the fullest extent, I would say. He just said that we all have our biases that occur because of the societal norms.
Yeah, okay, so human biases influenced by personal experience and societal norms. One more cognitive bias that I caught, I think, and if it helps, the words he used specifically was cognitive bias. So you might want to look back at your notes for that specific term. It is under an explanation of why predictive algorithms might be better.
Maybe it's about the bias about the present.
Very good. Okay, there we go. So to the speaker that said that there wasn't really an identification of the problem in status quo, you are correct in saying that the speaker did not, that the corner did not directly come out and say, these are the 4 problems we are trying to solve, but he did list quite a number of problems with human biases, including influence from personal experience, social norms, and a bias towards presentism. However, okay, I think there are also, I think there are also other things he listed in terms of problems that he sees in status quo, right? And could we just come up as a discussion with some of those problems as well? Because this is quite a rich speech. It's rather a lot to unpack.
Sorry, can you ask the question again?
Sure. So what are some other problems he might list that don't really have to do with bias?
The limitations of humans, because he said like AI crunching data is a lot more faster than like a civil servant sitting at their computer. They can't process that much data.
Very good. Okay, so these are the two large problems that he essentially sets up during his speech. So he does in fact describe what status quo is and what the problem is. So yay, we have at least that sorted out. Now, what are the solutions that he lists? Why does he think that predictive algorithms might be a solution?
I think he gave like three. First is analyze trend, which is looking at macro level. Is that?
Okay, analyzing trends at a macro level, sure.
Deal with a lot of data because they don't need break.
Okay.
And third is they are not personal. There's no feeling attached.
Okay, great. Does anybody want to add anything to that?
I think he also mentioned something like instead of being reactive and then like as things come to them, they react to it. The data also allows them to find the source of these kinds of problems and also possibly go and react, proactive rather than reactive. That's right, yeah.
Okay, fantastic. Okay. Does anybody else want to add more things to that?
He also talked about the trade-off between privacy and human security as a whole. Is that count as a argument or more of preemptive?
What do you think? What does everyone think?
It's more of a mitigation of a problem that opposition is definitely going to bring up.
Okay, so he's trying to do a lot of preemptive work with his setup. So this is what I meant by basically saying that your setup can be incredibly rich in terms of how it strengthens your argument. So if you look at this speech, right, I think he spends a good like 3 minutes on his setup, or 3 or 4 minutes, but within it, he really does quite a lot to build a policy that attempts to regulate out as many privacy harms as he can. So he says, if you look at the setup, right, all the way at the start, he actually says things like, this is going to be depersonalized individual information like health data and recidivism rates. So all the way from the first point in the setup, already basically saying that we're going to anonymize this and we're going to remove any personal characteristics that might possibly arise. Then he actually talks about why, because it's deliberately anonymized and it's about associations between different abstract characteristics, that this is not going to be that huge a deal in terms of how much privacy you are losing. He then goes on to say quite a lot of privacy. Who wants to lay out this preemptive setup argument for me about privacy? So we've already covered the first bit, which is that they're going to anonymize the data. And again, this goes back to the mechanism, right? This is actually in his policy a little bit. So what else does he say about privacy? How else does he preempt this?
He also says that a lot of this data is already present within the public domain, and this debate is about discussing how it is used rather than who accesses it and whatnot.
Okay, so what does this do? Like, I know you can't actually compare it to any case, but when you say things like data is already present in the status quo, what is this argument trying to do? Like, what is the purpose of saying this?
It strategically undercuts opposition's idea that the government might weaponize this data and like use it against citizens.
Excellent. So it's strategically undermining the government's any possible claim that the government's going to collect lots of additional data and become surveillance state and whatever, right? It having a lot of preemptive material like this, in some sense, raises the threshold for arguments that come after it, meaning there is then a burden of proof on whatever argument that comes after it to now deal with the preemptive material that comes out in this speech. Does that make sense? I hope that's kind of clear. So again, even though a lot of it seems like setup, and when we started discussing the setup, what people said about it was, he gave a mechanism, there was a census, there were surveys, there were AI, there was an algorithm. If you unpack the setup a little bit more closely, you realize that there's a lot of preemptive material in there about how the data is going to be collected and used, which I think deserves to be highlighted, especially because I think because Prime Minister speaks first, people have a tendency to forget a lot of the material that was said in the speech because, like he points out, we have a presentist bias, and so the speech that sticks most in our mind is the speech that we last heard, in a sense. Okay, so I'm going to now, I think I want to move on pretty soon after this, so I'm going to open it up one last time to see if anybody that is participating in the workshop has anything to add to the PM speech at the moment.
Wasn't there a second even if about like I didn't hear it properly, but it was something about like the NSA and
So
like
he
government
basically,
stealing information.
sorry.
Yeah, so the second even if about the NSA and government stealing information, I think, was to back up this argument that the data is already present in the status quo, because he does point out that even if the data leaks, the NSA is already likely to have all of this data anyway. So it's not new information out in the public domain in the sense. Okay. What else? What else does he do in setup?
He said about how the data will be collected via survey. So is it fair for us to infer that that means that the data will be collected like through consent, like with consent, even though he didn't see it?
That's interesting. I didn't think of that. That's actually quite an interesting take on this. But I think I would say that he doesn't really weaponize his consent argument, nor does he say anything about survey other than one line that says, we are taking a survey. So I think it's probably unfair to read that much more into that argument, but I think it's an interesting take on it. Is that okay?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, no worries. So there's one more thing in setup that I want to draw your attention to. Where is this coming from? Where is this algorithm coming from?
Research by academics.
And what does that do? Open to anyone.
It's like impartial, so in the sense that it's not going to discriminate against anyone.
Okay, so maybe we think that academics are more impartial than perhaps governments, but what else does this do? What is the purpose of saying this? Again, let's look back at privacy, right? There was a clear preemptive purpose to talking about privacy. What is the purpose of talking about academics?
I think it's more. Sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
No, you go ahead. Sorry.
Okay. I think the reason why he mentioned is by academics because it's more like it's meant to portray like a more neutral sort of observerish sort of party as opposed to an agency or a part of the government that has a certain agenda.
Good. Okay. So again, it is preemptive, right? It is trying to preempt characterizations of a biased agency taking over, or perhaps a corporation. Not sure, but there is some preemption here of potentially worse characterizations. Okay, final thing before I really am going to move on. What can you tell me? What can anyone tell me about the trade-off that OG is willing to make?
He said something about like even if like there are like certain like privacy infringements that they can be given up for like human security issues of basically saying that we are going to reach out to people who need more housing and things like that.
Yep. Okay. So he explicitly makes a trade-off of privacy for security and quality of life. Okay. I think I'm just going to like cut the discussion here and then ask Viha, Amrit, or Beiqi to jump in with anything else they have to add.
I actually just want to add one thing, and that is a few other people have brought this up in a separate chat already, but that when we think about what PM strategy is and we evaluate what a PM should have done, and we think about time management as a speech, I think as a judge, we need to also consider how much of the speech got spent on just framing the entire debate and how much of the speech got spent on what we consider substantive material, and whether or not that makes a difference to what gets considered as OG's value contribution to this debate. And I think in this context, it is probably a little uncharitable in some instance to say, well, majority of the speech was framing and it's not really value contributing. So be fully aware that a lot of the framing setup, the policy, all of these things count as value contribution as well in the larger scheme of things.
Absolutely, absolutely. Definitely agree with that 100%.
Yes, so I have another thing. I mean, most of it has been covered already. Just an additional thought I had, which is when you are thinking about like the weighing stuff, like Viha is absolutely correct. I think it is definitely a value add to the debate, and it's quite important. It's not to say that, like, I think like the artificiated, like if it's weighing, it's not substantive, because I think what Connor does in the beginning about weighing why we should care about these things in terms of efficiency and like some core problems with like bureaucracy. I think it's important weighing to keep in mind as the debate goes on, because I think it has kind of set up a standard that teams need to like engage with, or whether or not we care about those concerns or if they are like competing concerns. So like I think like these things, as well as like what he's preempting, are super important moving forward in this, like when you're engaging with like, especially like closing half teams, right? Because the PM has given you things to consider as important frames when you're evaluating their arguments. Yep.
Absolutely. And just to add one thing onto weighing, you might notice that there was also a bit of weighing in this bias argument, where he essentially says, sure, algorithms may still be biased, but they are probably less biased than the individuals. So making another kind of, giving another kind of set of weighing metrics there. Beiqi, want to add anything?
No.
Okay, awesome. So if everyone is good, I'm going to stop the screen sharing now, and I'm just going to go back and I'm going to talk about rebuttals a little bit, and then I'm going to show you the next video. So rebuttals, because I'm going to show you the LO video next. So I want to explain explicitly what I think rebuttals can do. So rebuttals can do a couple of things, right? Rebuttals can directly attack an argument given, and we can call this rebuttal that attempts to challenge some kind of material that, in this case, PM has already brought up. If you're attempting to challenge material directly, there are a few possible outcomes that could happen. Number one, your rebuttal might do nothing. It's true. Some teams just give rebuttal, and then they expect that because they have just said this is a rebuttal, that they will automatically be credited for it. That is not true. See, that was a rebuttal. So your rebuttal could actually just do nothing. And as a judge, you must be very aware that when a team says this is rebuttal, sometimes they are really just saying, haha, this is not true, moving on, without giving a real reason for it. The second thing your rebuttal could do is one step beyond doing nothing, which is to say it will mitigate the argument without destroying it fully. So a mitigatory argument would be essentially something that says along the lines of, oh, but you don't get all the benefits you want because there are other factors to consider, or, but this doesn't apply everywhere. This argument only applies to like this specific group of people. So this kind of argument, this mitigatory kind of material, it narrows the scope of benefits that PM is able to claim, but it does not destroy the actual claim. Okay, so I think it's quite clear to see the difference. If I say that an argument only applies to a specific group of people, then the benefits also only apply to a specific group of people. But it's not the same as saying those benefits don't exist at all. So I narrow the scope of the impacts that a team can claim. I do not actually take away those impacts entirely. The third kind of rebuttal, okay, is the rebuttal that absolutely destroys the argument by explaining step by step why the various things that happen in the argument are just illogical, or they point out that there are things that are explained improperly. They just kind of break the argument down. The last thing rebuttal that directly challengers can do is that they can do some weighing, although I don't know if I would count this in rebuttal, but basically things that say, even if this team is entirely correct in what they say will happen, it is still better on our side because of XYZ reasons. So as you can see, rebuttals that directly challenge the team, there are like these 4 things that it could plausibly do. It could either do nothing, it could mitigate the argument, it could destroy the argument, or it could provide an even if tier to the argument. 4 things. So the other thing I want to say about rebuttal is that this is a trend that I've noticed people doing a lot, which is that they offer a competing claim instead of actually challenging the claim itself. Here's how it works. Perhaps I say that something is directly caused by something else. Maybe I say that revolutions are directly caused by economic inequality. And this is my argument, and I spend like, I don't know, 4 minutes making it as PM. LO comes out, and instead of arguing that revolutions are not caused by economic inequality, he presents a counterclaim. He says, revolutions are actually caused by resource scarcity, and then gives another 2 minutes of explanation on why revolutions are actually caused by resource scarcity. So there are now 2 competing claims for the same outcome. This is also a form of rebuttal. It is just not as direct a form of rebuttal as the first form I was talking about. Because in this case, you are essentially bringing in a new substantive argument, and you are saying, my explanation is better than the explanation you have provided. You are trying to provide a counter explanation. Does that make sense, kind of? Okay, I'm just gonna pause here in case people want to like think about things.
Excuse me. So how what kind of value does this kind of counter explanations have when we edge them?
Well, they can have a couple of things, right? First of all, maybe your counter explanation is just so much more convincing than my explanation. And if your counter explanation is true, then my counter explanation is either significantly diminished in value or just not true. Which is, this is like a very convenient scenario actually, because if one team's counter explanation is just so much significantly more plausible, then it is likely that as a judge, I will be more persuaded by the counter explanation than by OG's original explanation. So this helps you decide which claim wins out, and so which team becomes, which team wins the clash over that claim in a sense. The second thing it could do, and this is quite a bit more common, is that one team will claim something, and then the other team will give a counterclaim that is pretty much to the same level, and then they will say something like, therefore we outweigh, or whatever, without really explaining why they outweigh, or how they outweigh, or what even the weighing metric is. In this case, what you then need to do as a judge is to very carefully look back at how well analyzed each claim was, doing the same thing we did essentially when we just dissected the PM speech. Because if they do not give you a weighing metric, they do not engage with each other at all, then you do need to look at their analysis and how well analyzed each claim was in reference to each other. Yeah? Viha, do you want to add things, or Amrit?
I actually just want to jump in very quickly, and it's a slight transgression, like a little bit, just to be like, all of that is also true when teams do things with implicit definitional challenges at LO, yes, where 100%. They automatically are just like, we don't have to defend burden X, or we don't have to defend burden Y, we are only going to defend burden Z. Then all of that weighing up about what analysis was better completed is also the method of deciding which definition of burden is right.
Yeah, so I just have one thing to say. Like, I think all of this is correct. And obviously, like, just because someone doesn't go, your thing is wrong, is not rebuttal, obviously. I just want a word of caution because I've noticed this as like a thing that judges do is like, it is entirely plausible because like debating is like not perfect people, that there are two claims in the debate that have like kind of equal weight, because you're very lucky in the situation where one team has like a counter characterization that you think is so much more believable in that it refutes the other team. It is plausible that two teams have characterizations that you think are like equally well made. Don't immediately as a judge jump in to like preference one over the other where there are implicit rebuttals. So like I just would caution you when you're making this decision of what is indeed a valuable counterclaim to overcredit something just because it exists. Like if someone says X is true for 3 reasons, if someone says Y is true for 3 reasons, I hear judges all the time just going, I think Y is more like intuitive without any explanation for why the average reasonable person believes that to be true, or like the mechanisms in the specific mechanisms are like better. Obviously people can have 3 mechanisms each, but like, it's about the way each mechanism is more well explained and stuff like that. So just don't be flippant about picking counter characterizations and implicit rebuttals as preferable against one another. Yeah, that's just my caution.
Awesome, thank you. Okay, I think this is basically all I have to say about rebuttals. What we're going to do now, okay, is we're going to watch the LO speech. And as you watch the LO speech, pick out the rebuttals that she's making and then see what those rebuttals are doing. Then we'll do a PM LO comparison. Okay? Get your notes. Our next speaker is Shamila.
Can we have the motion slide also once more?
The motion's been sent in the Zoom chat if you need to check it.
Oh, okay, thank you.
No worries. Wow, I just started playing the video without sharing the screen. This is excellent.
Thanks so much, Connor. And the third one, and hi everyone, I'll be talking about three themes today, and I will be integrating my rebuttal and my constructive. The first theme I'll be talking about is efficiency. The second one is accountability. And the third one is privacy and surveillance. So let's talk about efficiency first. It's true, we do have problems with data management and data hygiene in the status quo. That's absolutely correct. We have problems with data gathering. We have problems with data storage. Fair enough. But we argue on our side that these things can be improved without using the AI-driven models of the proposition side. What we want to do is use humans and computers, because we are also allowed to use computers and filing systems on our side. So we think that improvements can be made with data collection and data gathering processes. In fact, this is something they're also going to have to invest on in the other side, because if you don't have accurate data collection, which requires like human input and human investment, the kind of data you will be working on is unreliable and problematic anyway. So, you know, the ease and efficiency benefit from their side is not as great as they want to talk about, but there are like precarious things that will ensue. So we would rather rely on humans using their computers rather than outsourcing our policies to AI. Now, the next two things. Let's talk about accountability in a bit. It's not as if in the status quo, we lack awareness of the imperfections of human judgment. The imperfections in human judgment is widely documented in the status quo. So it's not an issue of it being masked in any way in the status quo, right? In fact, we are sharply aware of racism in the criminal justice system or in the allocation of housing, for example. And in fact, we argue it is easier to spot it and track it when you are dealing with humans. It's also easier to hold humans accountable because you can investigate their backgrounds, you can fire them, you can choose not to elect them next time, or you can retrain them. And it is a lot harder to do these things when you are dealing with machines or AI, because how exactly do you examine the biases inherent in AI systems, right? How can you tell if the algorithm is necessarily being objective or impersonal? Like, this is not an assumption we can make, especially if the speaker before me has conceded that it will be working with incomplete data in the first place, right? So if these systems and programs are fed problematic data, that is going to translate into flawed algorithms. And these incomplete data sets then are, well, harder to scrutinize because people are less able to when it comes to AI rather than tracking individuals and their decisions and their isolated decisions. And these same biases will have self-fulfilling loops in their world too. So for example, if someone is coded by an AI program as an unreliable borrower, that person is unlikely to take out a loan, that person is unlikely to get a house, that person is unlikely to be able to send their kids to school. So these loops also exist in their world, right? And also, how are they going to get access to these informations? Are they, like, I don't know, lifting patents over information in their world? I mean, at least humans can be summoned and compelled to provide evidence and to explain their reasoning for their decisions in a more transparent way in our world. Now, before I continue, was there a point?
So Sharmila, you said that you're going to use both humans and computers, but to what extent then are you using predictive modeling or any kind of modeling at all? Like, are you using mathematical modeling, statistics? Is it just people using Excel spreadsheets? To what extent do computers play a role?
So we're not going to use machines that can generate decisions and models on their own without human intervention anymore. So the human intervention has to be significant on our side. So Excel is our friend, statistics are our friend, but we're not, employing thinking machines that essentially replace the presence of humans in this decision making. I mean, obviously Excel is important, both sides want it. Now, we will never, and broader point we're making here in terms of accountability is we're never going to understand AI and the flaws of AIs in the same way we can human agents. So during the US congressional hearings, for example, on Facebook and Google, these tech executives just ran circles around our legislators. So one question that Zuckerberg was asked, for example, was, how do you sustain a business model in which users don't pay for your service? Which is quite funny, which shows the depth of their, lack of their ignorance of tech, right? So the CEO of Google was asked, why does searching for idiot return photos of Donald Trump? The CEO of Google was also asked why hateful information about a particular representative showed up on his 7-year-old's iPhone. What is he supposed to know about iPhones? He's a Google CEO. But the point I'm making here is, even our regulators and what more the general public are not going to understand AI, are not going to be able to scrutinize it in the same way we can a judge with a track record of, convicting people of color more harshly. Finally, on the point of privacy and surveillance that was, brushed aside by the first speaker, dismissed as a concern, we do think things get worse in our world because in the status quo, people are still on guard about privacy violations, and we are still more willing to scrutinize the state and how the state uses data. Whereas in their world, we've essentially legitimized and normalized a regime where the state is able to surveil its population and gather data on every aspect of their lives. While it is true that the data exists in abstract form, the state is still able to build profiles of dissident groups and dissident activity, for example, or surveil activists. And even if they can't, the fact that everyone knows that the power of the state to do so has significantly increased, and all of these things are legal and above board and hard to challenge, even harder to challenge legally now, that has a chilling effect on how individuals behave. It also becomes a lot easier for states to engage in targeted political advertising based on their access to this data, to manipulate people's public opinions. And these risks cannot just be dismissed as things that already happen now, because they become the norm and they become harder to fight in propositions world. We are very happy to oppose.
Okay, so that was the LO speech. Please take a minute to just go through the LO speech and flag the rebuttals, say what you think this speech did, and then we will quickly run through PMLO. Okay, so can I just get people to start sharing what they thought the LO contributions were? Same thing like we did previously, I'm going to screen share that Word document. Yeah, so people please feel free to just jump in anytime again, so we can run through the LO speech.
Yeah. In terms of the first substantive on sufficiency, I think there's like some work done to say on OP that they would try to have like improvements in terms of computers and humans, but like I'm not too sure why this is mutually exclusive to OP.
Okay, so about not being sure why it's mutually exclusive to OP, you will realize that in fact the LO points out that it isn't really, because OP Gov would need to do quite a bit of work to also improve their processes. Great, so who wants to add on to that?
I think she said in the second part, she said like imperfection about biases are already aware. Thus, those like problems are all able to be solved even in the operation paradigm.
Okay, can you be a little bit more specific about what the speaker says about biases?
Like the criminal in the criminal justice system, or like allocation of housing.
Yeah, so we know biases exist. What reason does she give to think that it is important to know that we know biases exist? Like, why is she saying this?
I think she's trying to explain how that's possible to be solved in the operation paradigm.
Yeah, she actually gives material for this. It is right after what she said about this. So I'm trying to push people in that direction. So this is open to anyone. What does the speaker say about biases specifically?
So she said that there's an already existing mechanism to check biases within the bureaucratic system as well.
Mm-hmm.
So she points out that we can like not re-elect individuals, or like fire them, or check their history to kind of analyze if they are like vulnerable to biases.
Okay, thank you. So this is an argument that's trying to respond to the PM argument about biases. So if we look at what's going on, what form of rebut, like how much do you think it responds to the Prime Minister claim about bias?
I think it's just a mitigatory response.
Okay, why?
At this point.
Okay, why?
Because like checking biases and like having existing mechanisms just like make sure the problem isn't that bad, but like it doesn't like bring about any benefits.
Good, okay. So it's mitigatory at the moment. It minimizes problem, but does not bring additional benefits. Great. So what else does this person say about biases? Very interesting.
It's
did some,
relatively
like interesting things.
Speaking of biases, the speaker said it's more easier to spot the person rather than AI because average individual do not understand the mechanism of AI. And give an example of like US politicians asking the CEO of Google or Facebook.
Okay, so people do not understand technology, right? So specifically what you said is that they don't understand AI, and then she gave 2 examples of Google, Facebook execs. What do these examples do?
I think it highlights the difficulty for like average individual to scrutinize the mechanism of AI, and it proves the fact that like the humans are more easy to scrutinize compared to AI. Like it just highlights the logic, I guess.
Okay, so it provides an example to illustrate the logic, right? But you will notice that this is actually an example. This is actually an example of a point that's brought across by some quite intuitive case studies that doesn't actually go into unpacking the logic of why people are understanding AI. So it's very important to note that the point is there. The illustration of the point is there. You might even think that the point has been made, but in reality, if you unpack it, it is two examples illustrating a point without going deeply into the reasons or the mechanisms of AI and why people are able to understand them. Okay, so you need to bring in all this analysis stuff from previously as well when you are evaluating LO arguments in addition to talking about what kinds of rebuttals this LO is giving. Okay, awesome. So what else does this LO say?
In terms of the biases that are existing, I think something else which was interesting was how LO tried to flip this argument by saying that they do have this, these biases are existent in their world as well, even because like the people who code these AI algorithms do have certain inherent biases.
Okay, so algorithms might be biased.
Yeah.
Okay, so what does PM say about this? What does PM say about algorithms might be biased? What is this actually trying to directly attack?
It means that if biases exist on both sides, it's about which team can acquire like the most objective information, and then she presents reasons as to why accountability happens a lot better with humans. So like you retain information, you can track them, you can follow up, you can fire them, whereas with AI, it's a lot more difficult.
Very good. So you're right in saying that it's trying to push back against the perception that algorithms are more biased. PM actually says, right, in talking about bias, that even if algorithms are biased, they might be less biased than individuals. It is this bit that I'm like kind of highlighting on the screen. So what Ella's speech is doing is Ella's speech is trying to attack this particular bit and say, actually, no, algorithms are biased and they're biased in quite bad ways. You notice that she doesn't actually do the effective comparison between algorithm bias and human bias. She merely gives some reasons why algorithms might be biased. What reasons does she give for algorithms being biased?
That programmers themselves might be biased.
Okay, so where does she say that programmers themselves might be biased?
Sorry, what?
Okay, can you, what language was she using when she said that programmers might be biased?
I don't think I took that down, sorry.
Okay, no worries. People, you might want to jump in. What specifically did she say about why algorithms might end up biased?
I might not have get like fully, but I think the speaker said self-fulfilling prophecy or stuff like that.
Yep, okay, so there's a self-fulfilling prophecy, thank you. Anyone else?
I think she mentioned incomplete data.
Incomplete or problematic data, that is correct. Okay, so how did she explain this self-fulfilling bias prophecy?
Comparative as to how is it indifferent from the way that it happens, in the sense that it keeps on being in a loop because it doesn't change anything about how the AI sees these people. So like she illustrated in an example that if like a person is unable to qualify for a loan, they will continuously be unable to qualify for a loan because there's like no additional data added or no other different considerations added to the AI there. Yeah.
No other data and no other considerations added. Is that your language or her language?
That's what I got from what she was talking about, because she was illustrating it in that way. But so this is me jumping off her illustration as opposed to explicit language that she used.
Exactly. And that's why I think it's important to focus as far as possible on explicit language, because she didn't actually give all this, she didn't actually give all of this analysis about how you don't have additional data or you can't ever change the data. She merely just illustrated it by saying, if someone is coded as an unreliable borrower, that person is therefore unlikely to get a loan or get housing or get into school. All these things about how the data is unchangeable and you can't get additional data on top of that was brought in, not by her, but by people here while discussing the logic. which is why I think it's actually quite important to look at specifically what they said instead of relying on our own, perhaps broader understandings of what they are trying to say. Don't complete arguments for speakers. If a speaker is just giving an example to illustrate an argument, take it that the example was given, but the logic behind the example was not necessarily explained. Okay, so if we're done with that particular bit, can I just ask people to jump in with other things that they think LO did? If there's anything, or if not, we're just going to move on already.
I think at the end of the speech, she also talked about privacy.
Good, absolutely. So what did she say about privacy?
She said, in the status quo, people are more aware of their privacy, but with AI, it will become a normalized the surveillance, and she talked about chilling effects.
Okay, so AI will normalize surveillance. Okay, what is the weighing that she makes in order to try to make this normalized surveillance argument more important than what OG says? Because you realize OG says the data is already present in status quo, so everything is status quo. How does LO try to make the argument overcome this? It's in the last 2 lines of the speech.
I think in 2 different ways. The first is that the state is able to build up profiles of dissident groups, and the second is that they're able to manipulate public opinion.
Okay, why can't they do that with data that already exists? How is this different from status quo? Because PM is characterizing it as the data is already present in status quo.
Because as human, even the top judges cannot evaluate the AI, cannot understand AI.
How does that relate to this? Isn't that part of a separate argument?
I think I heard like words of hard to challenge in these privacy sections. I might be wrong.
Yes, hard to challenge, but notice the language that she was using. It's not that you are challenging the AI because you don't understand it. What she specifically says is it is now legal and above board, and therefore it is hard to challenge legally. So this is actually, if you look at the first sentence she says in the privacy argument, it's about legitimizing and not legitimizing this regime, right? It's basically making it legal for the government to do things like this. And so this becomes the norm, which makes, so it entrenches what is in status quo, and it could get worse over time because it becomes normalized. So that's how they're trying to break this idea that all the data is already in status quo. They're trying to point out that it's going to entrench a norm and make the norm hard to challenge. Does that make sense to people?
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. Viha, do you want to jump in just before we wrap up LO?
I think there was also a counter mechanism, rather saying that what status quo right now is acceptable because the hybrid system right now is better, where it's just humans, AI, and a filing system.
Yep, okay. Humans and computers can work together. We can improve the data collection process. Yep, covered that earlier. Thank you. So, Viha, do you just want to jump in quickly before we wrap up LO?
No, I think that's about it. We can move on.
Yes, let's move on.
Sorry, could I ask about the responses under the accountability bit? So my interpretation of the speech was that she's like, even if I believe that feeding problematic data to an AI will generate equally problematic conclusions, I thought that was something that PM concedes actually. When he suggests that like biased outcomes also exist. So would I be right to, so if I use that to suggest that the difference is in the way you interpret that data, which isn't really dealt with by the material that is given in LO, am I jumping into the debate?
Let's see. So I don't think you are jumping into the debate because PM does explicitly say that it is about the ways in which we interpret the data. PM has now said algorithms might be less biased than individuals. LO has said algorithms might be more biased than individuals. I think that neither of these comparisons are necessarily explained in terms of algorithms being directly compared to humans. PM gives some reasonable claims why humans might be biased, and LO gives some reasonable claims why algorithms might be biased. At this point, you'd probably be relying on looking just purely on analysis because they do not actually directly engage and compare with each other on this.
Right, thanks.
No worries. Okay, cool. So I'm gonna stop the share for now. And I'm just gonna very quickly, sorry, this is all taking like much longer than I expected it would, and I'm trying to just move things along. Okay, I want to just quickly talk about new material in DLO, because I think that's quite important in explaining how you compare, how you evaluate top half. All right, so DLO is kind of like an extension speech in the sense that you are saying things and teams are unable to respond to them. Like in an extension speech from member of Gov, like OO has no chance to respond anymore, right? Like in a speech from member of Op, OG also has no chance to respond. So in a way, you should think of judging DLO as judging a speech in which at least one team has no chance to directly respond within speeches anymore. Two things I want to flag here. Number one, backloading isn't a thing. Like backloading is a term that became popular like a while back to describe a situation where DLO just packs quite a lot of material into the speech and LO doesn't pack that much material into their speech. But I think people get overly obsessed in considering whether something was backloading or not, and that ends up being letting judges do things like, oh, I penalized this because this material came out late, which really shouldn't be happening. So when you judge a speech, ignore considerations of backloading. Like, don't ask yourself, is this backloaded? Because the answer that comes out is not going to be super helpful in actually helping you judge the debate. You should judge the debate as it occurred. I guess the second thing to point out about backloading is that strategically, it might not actually be the smartest thing to do either, because backloading, just in case any of you are considering speaking, backloading in DLO means that your LO speech is just significantly less persuasive. If the large swathe of your material comes out in the deputy, your LO speech, what is the LO speech doing? It's not clear. And this might actually weaken your team's case as a whole, because probably you are getting out less material in just 7 minutes than you would be with the full 14 minutes. But it also weakens your case, right? Because it means that because you want Deputy Prime Minister to be able to respond to your speech so that you can then deal with the Deputy Prime Minister's responses to your speech. You don't want a situation where you prevent OG from responding, and then the first response to your case is from CG, who you are then unable to directly respond to. And then CG gets credited with this material, you can't directly attack them except with points of information, and that just puts you in a strategically worse position in many cases. So don't think about if backloading is a real thing, and also if you're like speaking, consider packing material evenly in both speeches rather than in one speech. Okay, so here are common mistakes that I think happens when you are judging speeches that pack a lot of material into DLO. Number one, judges tend to omit and neglect implicit responses from OG that indirectly interact with DLO. And that's very important. The second common mistake is that some judges just tend to let OG's claims fall out of the debate because they don't look at what remains unresponded to. They just kind of take it that if DLO has responded, then the OG case must be defeated, but they don't really look at what remains of the OG case after DLO's response. So it's very important to make those comparisons. I'm now going to go through the things that you must consider when you are judging DLO versus OG. Number one, you must consider if OG material interacts preemptively with DLO material. Must. And this means all of OG material, including the framing and setup that we went through earlier. Does OG material interact preemptively with DLO? Second thing, does the DLO respond to OG's case charitably? Meaning, are they responding to OG's best case, or are they responding to strawman version of OG case? Number three, are the DLO responses sufficient to everything OG has brought? Because I think there's a tendency very often when we do rebuttals, we simplify the other side's case and we just attack like some bits of it, right? Or we respond only to selective portions. It's very important that judges be aware of teams doing this so they can look at what's left after selective portions have been responded. And the last thing to note is that just because DLO has a response doesn't mean that the response is going to be strong. The response can be mitigatory, or it might not do anything, all the things that we went through earlier for rebuttal. So by the end of the exchange, look very carefully to see if whatever OG material remains still counterweights the OO material. Okay? Okay, so if no questions about that, no questions about how you are judging DLOs and what you must consider, I'm now going to play DPM DLO, and then we're going to judge the top half as a whole, okay? So DPM DLO, 2 speeches this time. He's going to play the whole top half.
Thanks, Shams. Okay, we welcome the Deputy Prime Minister to give a speech not exceeding 7 minutes. Here.
Panel, it is amusing how Sharmila thinks, Excel will solve all of our problems because, famously you can apparently add up the same amount of information in an Excel, and that's fine if just, civil servants use 1 computer per person, that should, give you the data. But of course, the problem here is one of A, ability to go through the data physically, B, ability to centralize it, because if every civil servant uses 1 computer, sure, but you won't be able to track any kind of biases, across those many sort of civil servants and can't hold them accountable because each is using their own little Excel spreadsheet based on a tiny amount of data and reaching whatever conclusions they'd like to reach in sort of a centralized one, right? So obviously the comparison is imperfect here, right? But in my speech today, 4 main points of rebuttal and then some more additions on what you've already heard from Connor. So first, in terms of rebuttal, I think the first thing we hear from Sharmila, well, one of the most impactful things, right, is that, you're going to code in biases as well, right? And this is a problem because you're constructing these mechanisms as well. Like, to some extent, fair enough. All of these AI systems will be based on sort of human construction. They're likely to inherit some problems, right? The comparative here is, sure, they might inherit some problems, but the comparative world is one in which humans already have all of these biases, those civil servants already have all these biases, but those biases are multiplicated, right, in terms of their effects by the number of civil servants using them and using them differently, and more importantly, using them without knowing that the others are using those biases, right, and applying those same biases which Sharmila claims will enter these systems. The comparative with the algorithm on our side is that A, it can be criticized centrally, right? So you can specifically criticize and scrutinize a specific piece of reasoning and a specific piece of data to do with one system rather than having to go through every computer of every civil servant, right, or every decision-making process on a granular level, which you don't have the ability bureaucratically to do. But second of all, more importantly, sure, there are some initial inherited biases which the system has, but an AI and a machine learning-based system has the great advantage of being able to adapt to reality, so overcome those initial biases, because when it receives more and more data, it recognizes that those initial biases are actually not in line with reality, right? Not in line with the behavior of, Afro-American populations, which were initially deemed to be slightly more criminally inclined rather than the net population, right? The problem is, the important benefit here is that they can adapt to the reality, right? The third benefit in comparison is, again, an Excel spreadsheet is a very narrow snapshot of society which a civil servant uses, right? On the comparative, this bird's eye view that this algorithm has can take in far more data and use it to evolve beyond those biases, actually assess the entire society and trends which exist. I also want to point out on this point is, if they're going to criticize data for being bad, data is already used, right, by civil servants as they claim, right? The problem is it's, as I've said, incomplete data based on snapshots and not holistic. The last problem I'll point out here is that because this data is already in use, it actually, without a centralized algorithm, disparate sets of data allow conclusion shopping by politicians, right? So essentially, it's civil servants or politicians who have a goal in mind, a desired outcome or hypothesis, right, which they think will please their electorate, and they will then seek out data which fits that specific theory or policy, right? They will find data because there's such an enormous amount of sort of data out there. But the problem is because, and they'll be able to present that data as being compelling scientific evidence for why you should adopt this actually bad policy. When you have a centralized AI system, right, you can't do that anymore, right? Because any sort of such theory which you're trying to conclusion shop, right, will be debunked by your AI, which actually corroborates data together. Now, second point of rebuttal, I think Sharmila tells us, but humans can get better. You can retrain and fire people, right? And you can't change this AI. This is absolutely false, right? You can easily tweak this algorithm to adapt if it needs to be done, right? Even more so, I want to point out that tweaking the algorithm is far better because the debate and scrutiny about what the algorithm should be doing will be science-led. It will be led by the scientific community poring over the data and data sets within these AIs, specifically because, as Sharmila says, politicians don't understand it, right? So crucially, it will be data scientists which look at how the reasoning was done. So the debate will be driven by scientists, right? That means that you can get far better tweaks rather than firing bits of the civil service. I want to also point out that they can be tweaked, that these tweaks can be done far easier than firing entire swathes of a bureaucratic system, which will leave you dysfunctional as a country for a long time, and additionally, which you'll be able to replace completely. Now, third point of rebuttal. Crucially, Sharmila says, we're aware of these problems, right? We know that there's problems within the criminal justice system. Yeah, but the problem is you have no clear proof by accruing data to use these known problems, right, to prove that you have to adopt policies. So for example, by implementing this AI, you will see clear accrued data that, for example, increasing jail terms does not create deterrence, right? Or increasing jail terms does not reduce recidivism, rather hampers rehabilitation. The problem is, indeed, in debate circles, we know this. But the problem in reality is there are studies, right, from criminology institutes which show these things that, for example, jail terms don't work. But the problem is they're disparate studies. They are studies which are dismissed as anecdotal by politicians and say, it's not centrally accrued, we don't know for sure. Some scientists say this, some scientists say that. And crucially, what this allows is one of the largest problems in politics. In politics right now, one of the largest problems is a false equivalence, right? The notion in politics, that there is a debate about anything, right? There's both sides to, whether we should use huge jail terms, right? And which allows politicians to dither and to choose either, option which is politically palatable to their supporters. This will not be possible when you have absolutely compelling, overwhelming data on this particular side accrued by this AI, right? Lastly, I just want to point out that I think you've heard no response on how actually you're going to focus on far more structural issues, such as, what exactly within the Afro-American community is deprivileged in terms of lack of education, right? Or lack of sort of job opportunities, which creates, in many instances, right, perceived spikes in criminality, right? Which allows you to deal with the larger problems initially, right? But lastly, I just want to point out that a lot of this will be able to debunk fake science. Connor told you about how these AIs can be proactive rather than reactive, right? And they can act to prevent things before they happen, which means acting far faster. In the coronavirus, right, outbreak, right, the writing was on the wall since January, right? Previous pandemics were able to predict these problems. Governments did not act and acted very late, right? Because they had to play catch up because they did not act. And lastly, as I was saying, it debunks fake science. Politicians won't be able to say, let's just use herd immunity, guys. That'll work, right? Because the AI debunks it altogether. Because of all these reasons, please propose.
Thank you, Tutor. I now invite the Deputy Leader of Opposition, here.
Data is sexist, privileged, and racist. Human beings have the ability to recognize that. AI does not. Three things in this debate. First, why is it that the AI is likely to make wrong predictions based on its data as opposed to human beings? Second, who is more accountable? And third, on the issue of moral calculations, why we do not trust the AI. So first, why is the AI likely to make wrong predictions? Two reasons. First, because the data is skewed. As we have already told you, that the information that has historically existed is obviously skewed. For example, if you look at the criminal justice system, it's extraordinarily racist. What does this mean? It's not as if what OG has said, which is that the AI is just going to take on some of the biases. No, it is the opposite, which is that it is going to take on this bias and emphasize on this bias and exacerbate the worst harms of human biases, because humans can at least recognize and correct for some of these biases, whereas AI does not. A couple of examples here. One, for example, when it comes to police deployment, it looks at poor neighborhoods as generally being those of having higher crimes. It ends up allocating more police officers there, which inevitably results to more arrests, i.e. creating a feedback loop where it pats itself on the back for making the correct decision and doubling down on the decision as it develops. A second example could be, for example, looking at detection of cancer. Privileged areas are more likely to have higher detection rates because people who are richer go to hospitals more often, get these medical checkups. Often this means that it's going to allocate funding for cancer, for example, towards already pre-existing privileged areas. These are errors in data that human beings, through sheer common sense, can correct for just by looking at it and realizing, obviously, infection rates in richer areas are higher because of the fact that richer people get tested more. But this is information that might be common sense to us, but an AI does not have the capability to recognize and correct for, which means it creates a feedback loop which makes the situation significantly worse and exacerbates the worst harms of the skewed data and the worst harms of the human bias, which is why we think it makes it significantly worse. The second reason why AI is likely to make wrong predictions is because data often does not give context of today. So decisions have to be made in keeping in mind current context. Often historical data is devoid of this context. So for example, policing deployment decisions are after the Michael Brown issue, for example, should be inherently different to what would have been if you just focused on historical data. Another situation would be, for example, making policies about housing development in often recently racially politicized areas, such as in Rwanda, or even whereas in the aftermath of Hindu-Muslim riots in Bangladesh or India. These are context-based decisions that often have to be taken. The data simply does not provide the context for, which is why it makes these wrong decisions. I think here, the only logic OG has provided is that they're likely to be proactive because it can look at data and take these decisions beforehand. And literally the only example was the coronavirus pandemic. What data is going to be there for it to talk about? Like, is it going to look at the Spanish flu from back in the day and talk about, like, yeah, that might happen in today's context? These are absolutely missing data that no kind of proactive decision-making can be made by the AI in the first place. So firstly, I think on that, OG already falls because they are making wrong predictions because the data they're feeding to it, something that humans can easily check for through sheer common sense. Second, in terms of accountability, who is more accountable? Is it humans or is it the AI? We would say the AI is not accountable for, let's say, 3 reasons. First, because the information that you need to scrutinize. I know OG used the word granularity a lot of times to talk about accountability, but I don't think that really explains how this works, right? So when you're talking about a private company that owns the process through which this decision is made, so public don't have access. Why is this? So for example, when the company Compass has the information on how police deployment occurs, it is not publicly available because that is property of that company. If it is publicly released, it means rivals have an edge over it, right? So rivals can copy it, it is the intellectual property. So people don't even have access to the information to be able to scrutinize the processes through which AI makes its decision. But second, let's assume somehow you have the ability to make this information public. Even then, this is extraordinarily difficult to actually scrutinize. Why? Because the way AI makes I got cut.
You're back.
Okay. So where did you hear me last?
Even if it is public, it is extraordinarily difficult to scrutinize.
Okay,
at 452. Yep.
Okay. The reason it is difficult is because AIs make these decisions very differently from how human beings make it. a single decision, simple decision by an AI, if you ask for the explanation, it would be a 400 to 500 page book of different algorithms run through the system that a human being, even the owners of the AI, would not be able to understand and explain. As opposed to human beings, where one or two overriding considerations usually are the reasons why people make decisions, which are far easier to be held accountable. So you wouldn't even know how these processes are made to be able to hold them accountable. The third reason why AI is incredibly difficult to hold accountable is, as OG suggested, the average human being is very different from debaters, right? Which essentially means that there's a veneer of scientific validity to the system, which means people are unlikely to want to question how this AI works in the first place. So we don't even know how the scrutinization or the mobilization would occur for the scrutiny to happen. Sure.
So which one is it? Is this AI does it take into account so many factors that it's so complex that it cannot be scrutinized, or does it not take into account historical context at all, the specific instances of individuals, which allows it to focus on larger trends and structural issues such as poverty or unemployment rather than criminality?
Both. It takes into account lots of different considerations based on the data available to them. Sometimes the data is missing, which is problematic. Based on the data that is given to them, it takes into consideration huge swaths of information from the data set, which itself might be problematic, but then again, you can't also scrutinize because of how it works. As opposed to human beings, there's at least some forms of accountability that can happen. Firstly, a lot of bad decision-making by AI will be made based on the fact that humans would not have a reason to be biased in the first place. But secondly, there are some ways in which people can be held accountable. Politicians can be bought by companies, but also through the vote can be held accountable. Judges can go through votes, but can also be shamed based on the record, on the pattern of decisions they have made. These are decision-making processes. That means that there are processes through which human beings can be held accountable in a way that AI can never be. And that's why it's fundamentally problematic, we oppose.
Okay, so same thing as previously, DPM and DLO is done. Take 1 or 2 minutes to look over your notes, and then we're going to run through DPM, followed by DLO, followed by judging the top half. Beiqi, maybe this is a good time to say what you want to say.
Okay, hi, can you hear me?
Yep,
okay. So I think that this is just to help everyone organize the arguments, the claims, and all the clashes. So I think that it's easy to look for something that we already look for in our daily lives into benefits and the harms. So this will help you to then categorize what are the harms, what are the benefits. So I think I'm just going to go through the simple steps into how you frame these things. So for example, the benefits. What are the responses coming out from opposition that suggest that you can co-opt the benefits, which means that you can achieve it on both sides? By achieving that, it means that whatever you can achieve on perhaps government can also be achieved by opposition. Then it doesn't make sense for us to then use big data. Then the next step is to then look at what are the responses to then try to mitigate the benefits. So instead of saying that we can achieve the same amount of benefits and the same quality, there are some instances like saying that there are unequal distribution of benefits, such that it's really limited to the handful of people, and therefore they shouldn't be considered that much or given much weight. Then moving on to the harms. So a lot of times there's also attempts to make the harms symmetric. So as you have heard from a PM, by saying that, look, it's symmetric on both sides. The data are already being collected, the bias exists, it's the same, so it doesn't incur that much harm, but here are the benefits. So the first step that most speakers do can be, what are the responses that suggest that they are trying to wash it out to make it an equal playing field, and then zooming into other areas to break the deadlock and to flip the arguments to prove that which side better than mitigates the harms of bias, etc. So I think it's just to help you get a sense of how you categorize the arguments instead of going chronologically or finding ways in which one you find more persuasive first. So I think that this helps you to frame the kind of arguments to make sure that you're not leaving anything behind, and also to make it more organized. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Beiqi. So to borrow a phrase from Tudor and Connor, I think granularity is also very important when you are discussing clashes. So I think in addition to considering benefits and harms, which is pretty much any debate, right? One side has a benefit, one side has a harm. You might want to actually look at the big issues that were being tussled over within the top half. So one of the issues was bias, right? That was a very big issue that was being discussed. On which side do you have more bias or less bias? The second issue that was being discussed a little bit as well was in terms of outcomes for currently disenfranchised groups. In which side do you get better outcomes? Or privacy, in which side do you think wins the privacy versus quality of life clash? Because both sides were also doing quite a lot with that. So just also consider that there were lots of issues within the debate, and sometimes if you lump everything into just benefits and harms, you will realize there is too much going on, and then it will make your OA quite difficult for you to get through because it will be just extremely large chunks on either side. Okay, so back to you guys. Can we start talking about DPM's material?
So DPM wanted to talk about the idea that as opposed to the status quo right now, where you have to approach every individual person with bias, and then about the difficulties of doing that, at least with an AI, it's centralized. And then even if centralized and like above board, as they want to put it, at the very least, the people who are programming it are less likely to have any form of agenda messing with the way that they code it in the first place, because it's handled by academics.
Okay, thanks. So if you had to put this in a clash, meaning a large issue that teams are debating about, where do you think you would put this?
I think it would be under the idea of bias and accountability.
Thank you. So let's split that up because they're both quite big. So let's just classify this under accountability for now, right? Accountability, and then what DPM points out is that there is a centralized system, so it's easier to hold accountable. And then reinforces what PM has already told you, that it is better because, not actually because academics, but rather the specific language he used is that it is better because the debate and scrutiny about the algorithm will be led by the scientific community. So he's essentially saying the scientific community will hold them accountable. Thanks. Anyone else wants to add anything about what DPM does?
I felt like DPM was perhaps not really being very fair to opening opposition, because like he characterized the opening opposition as using Excel sheets that are disparate, but like opening opposition's model could also be centralized. It just doesn't need to use AI.
Okay. So right now we're looking at what he says. We're not doing the comparisons yet. I just want to tease out what exactly he's saying.
Oh, okay, sure. Sorry.
Okay, so what else are we crediting DPM with? So the reason why I usually like separating what we're crediting people with and how we're weighing them is because I think things can get very messy when you start jumping immediately into weighing, because not everybody is going to have a consensus on what we are even crediting in the first place. So at the point, if any of you are leading panel discussions or you are chairing a panel and you realize that everyone has different calls, sometimes it is actually just because people disagree on what actually has been said and what teams should be credited with. This is especially true in extension speeches because some judges might think that a lot has been added to the debate, whereas other judges may disagree and think that actually very little has been added, which is why I think it's very important to figure out first what everyone agrees has been added in the speech. Okay? Okay, so because we're now talking about what's been added, I'd like people to jump in.
Okay. On accountability, there was idea of data shopping, I guess, like some politician, like to appease their electorates, like use a convenient data sets.
Thank you. Prevents political data shopping to justify own outcomes. Would you say this is more accountability or bias?
I guess like
what is this argument trying to prove?
Yeah, I think like by centralizing the data to the government's AI, like OG achieves a better accountability compared to the status quo, where like different politicians using different data sets by data shopping.
Okay, so I think that these are actually just like slightly separate arguments, because accountability seems to be more about how we can hold the outcomes accountable, whereas data shopping was used to explain how you get certain outcomes, right? So one is about the process and one is about what actually happens. I understand there is some overlap, but I think the point of the data shopping point in this particular case was that it allows politicians to pick data to select to fit their actual outcomes. Okay, let's move on. What else are we crediting OG with? DPM.
I think the OG also talks about in terms of like say a better likelihood of achieving an outcome in term when it goes back to the point of like say being able to analyze like underlying trends. Just because you have so much data and you have consolidation of data, you can actually find out whether like employment is, whether there's a correlation with like say employment and crime rates.
Okay, so this goes back to PM speech, right? Like in terms of just the amount of data analyzed. So better outcomes. So if we want to fit things from PM under better outcomes, right, we could fit all of these things. You're analyzing trends at a large macro level, and you're dealing with large quantities of data. And then Deputy Prime Minister adds what you were saying, which is that you can find the underlying solution, backs up all this stuff about how it's proactive rather than reactive, and find the source of the problems. Does that sound like a correct summary, Vihasini, of what you were saying?
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. So if we can jump back to accountability for a second, and biases, what else are we crediting the Deputy Prime Minister with?
I think the Deputy Prime Minister did offer a rebuttal on why OO cannot hold government officials accountable, because he said you can't fire everyone, like large swaths of staff.
Okay, can't hold everyone accountable, sure. Okay, what else are we crediting DPM with?
Perhaps like some characterization also, because they talked about like coronavirus, the illustrate their point.
Okay, sure. So you are proactive rather than reactive. You find the source of the problems. Cool. So guys, think back to arguments, right? Like what are rebuttals instead of the examples, because I think there's still quite a lot of material we haven't covered. What do you think DPM has said in response to LO? Let's look at biases specifically, right? Because LO was basically saying things can be very biased. How does DPM respond to that?
I think in two ways. The first is that comparatively algorithms and databases can be recoded. And secondly, because of machine learning processes, like these inherited biases could be mitigated over time, especially when the data doesn't correlate to like things that are happening.
Good. Okay, so the algorithm will adapt to reality, which cuts against, right, what LO's assertion was, which was that this data, once you get it in, will just automatically run into a feedback loop because you are unable to change anything about it based on what we were discussing from LO's speech just now. Okay, what else does he say about biases? This time not about why algorithms are good, but rather why humans are bad.
I believe he flagged something along the idea that some studies can be dismissed because it's anecdotal.
Okay, so studies can be dismissed because they're anecdotal, sure. This is about political data shopping, right? This is like what we were talking about earlier. People can just use selective data to justify their own policies, dismiss studies that don't align or are anecdotal, whatever, right? Okay, thank you. Anything else about biases? Why are humans bad? It's right in the first rebuttal.
Oh, it is multiplicative because of multiple humans, but in the case of humans and computer, it won't be multiplicative.
Good, okay, so all the biases kind of pile onto each other. Okay, so I think that is quite a lot from the Deputy Prime Minister's speech. Can I ask if anyone has anything that they want to add to this that they think hasn't been covered yet? Okay, Viha, do you want to jump in for the DPM?
I think they did mention he did mention something small about how AI can act faster.
Sure. I think he doesn't do that much beyond what PM has already done, so I wouldn't credit that only to DPM. I think it's pretty much what was said in PM.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, Viha or Beiqi, do you guys want to jump in before we move on to DLO?
No, we can move to DLO.
Okay, so let's do DLO. What do people think DLO did? If we categorize them into kind of the same things, right? Privacy, accountability, biases, and outcomes. What did DLO add? And you notice that these categories we are putting down, right? They are pretty much the exact same thing that we have already put down. We're just, you see here, biases, the theme is because the arguments on both sides where algorithms might be biased, algorithms might not be biased. So they actually match quite perfectly with how teams themselves categorize what the clashes are. Okay, so can people just start talking about DLO?
Okay, like speaking on biases, like DL did first, data is likely to be skewed because it's taken by the already corrupted pre-existing system like criminal justice system, which is racist. Second, like data does not give context, so it is unfair for only favors the rich people, or like it is prevalent in police deployment and stuff like that.
Okay, so data is inherently biased because of historical reasons, and it's also missing context, and you also have missing data. Cool. What do people want to add to that?
I think he wanted to talk about more about the interpretation of whatever that comes out from the AI, because the AI doesn't lack human common sense, because he talks about how, like, if you see something that doesn't add up despite what you see, you at least have the common sense to make the correct decision.
Okay, so humans are better at making common sense decisions, right? Because this can check for missing data or problems that AI cannot. Okay, cool. So what do you think this does? If you look at this like in a chunk, right? Data is inherently biased because of historical context, the reasons, right? Algorithms might be biased because it's incomplete data, and humans are better at making common sense decisions. What else did he add? Because these are very like headliney, right? So did he add any explanations on top of what LO already flagged as headlines?
I thought the explanations mainly came in the form of like small case studies, in the form of like police deployment and testing for cancer.
Okay, so police studies and testing for cancer. So I think this actually explains in a little more detail about how self-fulfilling prophecies and feedback loops work in terms of how your data is interpreted and used. In this case, I think the case study used was explained, and the logic for how it follows the algorithm is also explained. So I think that does go into more detail than what LO does, which is simply flag that there may be a self-fulfilling prophecy with like a one-liner about how if you're flagged as a bad borrower, you can't get credit. Okay. Okay, so cool. what else does DLO claim? And again, remember, these are all headliney things, so we want to go a little deeper into them as well. Viha, maybe you can jump in. Or Beiqi?
I think Mubarak also put the idea out that the AIs are likely to be owned by private corporations, and because of patent laws, they are less likely to share the inner workings of it, therefore making it hard for the public to scrutinize its workings. I think this was something pretty new, pretty new contextualization coming from DLO, to be honest.
Okay, good. So it is likely that some of this AI is going to come from private companies. There's going to be patent law there. So what else does he say that brings this beyond just the context of private companies?
He said that even if it is public, people won't understand. I thought that was new.
But why?
No, I thought that was new because like previously, the stakeholder was like legislators, but now it's more like the electorate that he's talking about.
Sure. So, but what reasons does he give for the electorate not being able to understand things?
I think he's jumping off on the idea, like the illustrations of like how they are unable to question Mark Zuckerberg or the Google people properly. Like even the people who are in charge of making the law for us and who are supposed to be informed about it can't understand it. The general public.
This is what LO said. What did DLO specifically say? What reasons did he give for general public?
He said it's going to be like a 400 to 500 page report that people can't understand.
Okay, but why can't people understand?
I don't think he specifically said that, but I think it's because like it's niche knowledge.
Okay. He did actually say that. It's the next thing he said after 400 to 500 page algorithms. Could anyone jump in on that? What does he say about the average human being? How do they perceive algorithms?
Sorry, you.
So there's some. So he said that there's scientific validity attached to it. So whatever like they're doing will be deemed right.
Good. So whatever they're doing might be right. How does this impact humans in terms of how they interact with it? It means they
won't question the decision.
Good. That means they're unlikely to question in the first place, right? And the last thing the first thing he says actually is that AI just make decisions very differently from how humans make decisions. Algorithm decision-making process is very different, and so it's significantly harder to understand, right? So he actually says quite a lot on this that isn't covered in the LO speech. So, so he says, even if it's public, it's extra difficult to scrutinize because algorithms make decisions very differently from how humans make decisions. So it's difficult to understand what they're doing. Then he says this thing about the 400 to 500 page book of algorithms where even the owners don't understand it because of how exactly how different it is and how much code there is to step through. Then he says the comparison that human beings are easier to hold accountable because humans normally have 1 to 2 overriding consideration. So you notice he's doing the weighing here as well, right? Human beings, they have 1 to 2 very clear considerations of how they are making decisions, so it's easier to hold them accountable. And then he says this thing about the veneer of scientific validity. So it adds quite a lot of material, actually, not just jumping off this Google, Facebook executive example. Okay, so what else do we want to credit from the DLO speech? I noticed that it's actually the same people who are like speaking quite a lot. So if other people want to actually respond, that would be amazing as well.
He said something about Michael Brown and how policing ought to be different after that, although I'm not quite sure what's the point he was making there.
Okay, so the point he was making is that data is inherently biased because it misses the context of what's going on. So the Micro Brown example was him illustrating that there are sometimes there are sometimes just decisions that you shouldn't make purely based on data because there are other things you need to take into account as well.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so if no one else has anything to say about DPM adding nothing else to add about the Deputy Prime Minister, could I just ask you guys to make a call? Who do you think is winning the top half? Okay, if no one wants to discuss what they're going to say with regards to who they think is winning the top half, I'm just going to ask Viha to jump in and share what she thought about the top half.
Yeah. So I'm inclined to think that in the way of how opening half functions, a lot of what the distilled line of opposition is happens in DLO rather than LO, and a lot of it does clash with OG but not sufficiently take down a lot of OG's premises. So if I was to give a call, I'd probably lean OG over OO.
Okay, Beiqi, you want to jump in?
Yep, hi. I think that although DLO have a lot of new material and analysis, I think that some of the taglines of how they want to prove that there are more biases are already inherent. So I think that there are still grounds in which OG does clashes and engages with opening opposition. So I think that one thing, just to reiterate what Enting said earlier, do not address new material in DLO to just exclude them artificially and say that because DPM couldn't respond to whatever DLO said, let me remove them and therefore make it a fairer debate. You still have to try to engage whatever that was present. So DLO, even though the materials were new, DPM couldn't respond, you couldn't, in your OA say that because DPM couldn't respond, the opening clash, all these points brought up by DLO, I will not be weighing them. So you still have to weigh them as per the bias clash. How does the DLO material add on to this, and how does this interact with the responses coming up from OG as a whole in terms of how they view that humans are going to have more biases? So you still have to weigh it as a clash completely. Yep.
Cool. Do people want to chime in and talk about how they decided the top half, or?
Yeah, I think in terms of what you said right before both deputy speeches happen as well, in terms of how DLO material should should try to clash with the best case of OG, I think DLO did actually not do that in terms of talking about accountability and how predictive models can actually predict things like the coronavirus and whatnot. They try to not engage with their entire best case scenario. So I think in that case, well, I'd be inclined for OG over OO.
Okay, cool. Anyone else?
I think OO's concern is mainly about accountability and biases, and didn't quite charitably address the concern from OG about the better outcomes. So, and without explaining why accountability biases is more should be way over the clash of better outcomes. And yeah, I think that's also can be additional reason to favor OG over OO.
Okay, So I think it's very strange to artificially separate accountability and biases out from better outcomes, because presumably the reason you're talking about biases is because if there are biases, it's going to lead to a biased outcome. So I don't think you can just say, because OG claims you will have better outcomes, we can say that the bias and accountability stuff might not necessarily be important. I'm just going to step through very quickly why I think OO actually kind of takes this, despite a lot of implicit OG material. So I do think that OG doesn't quite respond to OO arguments about privacy. That's the first thing, right? About how you normalize surveillance, and you entrench this norm of surveillance occurring. The second thing is that if you look directly at the accountability comparison that I'm sharing on screen, OG essentially says the centralized system is easier to hold accountable. The scientific community can scrutinize this data and hold it accountable. Doesn't have to be politicians, and you can't hold everyone accountable because you can't fire everyone. I think what OO does a couple of things to this, right? I think opening opposition points out that OG can't limit it purely to academics doing it. It's likely that private corporations are going to do it, and in that case, you do have an extra problem with accountability. I think that's probably quite a fair characterization of how algorithm systems are likely to work in terms of private law and property law. The second thing they point out is that there are existing mechanisms to check biases which don't involve firing everyone. And I think this mitigates at least some of the harms that occur from the government side, because I don't think the government side actually gives many reasons why existing mechanisms to hold people accountable are not enough. They merely say, but you can't fire everyone, without talking about any of the other mechanisms that might be present as well, such as voting politicians out, such as questioning MPs, whatever. The third thing OO manages to say about accountability is talking about how people simply don't understand tech and AI enough to hold it accountable. So even though I buy that the scientific community can scrutinize the data and can hold it accountable, I need to also consider, from opening opposition, that you do have it is entirely possible that due to these different decision-making processes, the scientific community might similarly not be able to hold AI accountable. That's the first thing. So it mitigates some of the benefit that OG was able to bring. And the second thing was that there might not be mobilization of people willing to back this, meaning even if the scientific community tries to question the algorithm, there is no guarantee it translates into results because of the explanations OO gives about how people don't understand technology enough, and there is a veneer of scientific validity over it that means they are more unlikely to question it. Then they talk about biases, right? So OG points out that algorithms and databases can be recoded and you can mitigate over time because algorithms adapt to reality. I think opening DLO does enough to explain how, where you attempt to recode to reality, you are necessarily using biased data, which creates a feedback loop, which creates then more biased data, which is what the algorithm is going to be adapting to instead. So it will be adapting to a biased version of reality rather than the standardized version of reality that DPM wants to talk about. And I think enough of this comes out in LO that a response probably is expected in terms of trying to show how you can get that type of non-biased data and non-biased reality reflected. So OG also talks about political data shopping and using selective data. I think that this is good, and it's true that DLO doesn't do a huge amount to respond to it, but I think overall DLO is still able to show enough that there are a lot of biases existing, and it might actually exacerbate human biases compared to individual humans who tend to be more easily checked. So OG's claim is that multiple humans have biases piled onto each other compared to a centralized system. I think OO also shows that algorithms can also have that bias piled on just in terms of a feedback loop. And given that they show it's going to be harder to check, I am more inclined to give it to OO because of the bias and accountability arguments. I think this argument about how you can crunch massive amounts of data and be proactive in reacting is good, but also needs to contend with the ideas that you have lots of missing data. So even if you crunch even if you're able to crunch more data, it doesn't necessarily flow that you are crunching good data or able to get good policies coming out of that data. Okay, are people good with top half, or do you guys have any last comments to make? Okay, If no more comments to make about top half, I just want to quickly step through a number of things about extensions. So with extensions, right, I know Amrit said this yesterday, you're looking at new material that hasn't previously been in the debate. So you're looking at anything that is new can be considered an extension. New framing, new substantive, new rebuttal, even if it is not framed as an extension, you should be willing to consider it as an extension also, because that is simply what an extension is. It's just adding additive material to the round that wasn't there previously, even if it's just something as simple as adding a new layer of analysis or adding a new impact, that is considered an extension. What the difference is that just having an extension isn't enough for you to win anything. Your extension then needs to be substantively better than what OG and OO have added in order for you to place above them. So with extensions, it's extremely important to separate out what is added first and then compare only what is added to the opening government material. Meaning, if closing government makes the exact same argument as opening government, or CO makes the exact same argument as OO, but tag on a new impact at the end, you should only credit them for the new things that they have added, not for the material that they have borrowed from the opening half. Okay? Some common mistakes in judging extensions: watch out for EPL extensions, which are basically the same extension, but in nicer language. If the substantive matter of the point is the same, you probably shouldn't credit it as new material. Even if you don't flag the extension as extension, please remember to count it as extension anyway. Please don't focus only on the taglines. Sometimes people use the same headers for their extensions, but actually say substantively different things under those headlines. Okay, so we're going to watch the member of Gov and member of opposition now, and we're going to have a discussion about what we're crediting from both MG and MO.
Both machine opening opposition tells you that what they want to do is meld the best of both worlds, have both machine learning, or at least some level of statistics and Excel spreadsheets, and also the innate capacity of humans to recognize sexism, racism, and privilege wherever they go. I think that their problem is that they don't acknowledge that the vast majority of individuals who actually engage in statistical analysis couldn't tell you mathematically what the difference between an ANOVA and a t-test, what the difference between a student and a paired one is. And I think that problem, the refusal of human beings to understand their own unique myopic view of events, is their downfall. We say that statistics is a poor way of understanding when you don't have a big picture approach to it. One thing that I'm going to be talking about, I'm going to be specifically talking about why I said that policy making is massively improved at the point in which you have big data. We have 3 reasons for that we think are clearly distinct from OG, but I think that the main thing that we're going to add is we're going to very directly compare to the alternative that's provided by opening opposition. Before that, though, I do have 2 points of response that I'd like to delve in. Firstly, on the awareness of bias, and secondly, on their inability to understand machine learning and artificial intelligence. Firstly, on the awareness of bias, because what Shamila and then Mubarak also tell us is that it's easier to spot and track humans because you have the capacity to hold them accountable, because human beings have an ability to explain things that have gone wrong in their thought process. Overall, I think that there's 3 reasons why that's wrong. The first, and why we actually think that it's the opposite, that bias is actually easier to identify and track when you have big data models. The first one is that it's actually, counter to what they say, way easier to spot. Because at the end of the day, if you have a human resources executive at a company that hires 4 men and 1 woman, it's very easy for the company to just be like, you know what, that's fine. Out of those 5 candidates that we had positions for, maybe the men were just more qualified. It becomes infinitely more difficult to justify when an algorithm is telling you that what you should hire is 90 men and 10 women. And it is at that point where the sheer size of data sets that force you to realize the number of individuals that you're then hiring is that then it becomes more statistically, but also obviously significant. It is looking at things closely, which is what human beings do because we don't have the capacity to take in as much data, that allows us to better understand our biases. No, thank you. The second thing that we tell you is that also human beings have the capacity to explain. And unlike what OO says, that's actually a really bad thing. Because we don't think that individuals have the capacity to see racism wherever they go. We think that judges that convict rapists to 6 months of community service don't do it because they think that women are worth less and they were just looking for they do it because they genuinely believe that that is the right thing. They believe that that young man standing in front of them didn't really mean it, or he was just drunk, or he just didn't understand and misunderstood circumstances. And that is, in many cases, because of sexist bias. And I think that human beings just overall have an inability to admit when that happens. That is because we don't like to think of ourselves as bad people, so we're considerably less likely to admit to ingrained racism, ingrained sexism, ingrained homophobia. I think that overall, an algorithm just turns out data that its models were meant to give out. And that means that overall, when we find something suspicious about it, it kind of gives us excuses about why is it that black men behave more aggressively in court and therefore get convicted more. We are forced to look at the models. And if the model is strange, if it says that women are less capable, if it says that black people are more aggressive, then we're much more likely to look at the ingrained biases of it. We think that overall, when you have academics scrutinizing it, when it is in the nature of science to look at things such as why did you get the results that you got, it is much more important and much easier to do so than with policy decisions with humans who are used to giving excuses. The last thing that I want to talk about here is that also, humans don't actually realize when they lack data because we're kind of myopic in view. It is why, for example, most of us probably know that we know how to pump someone's heart when we think that they've had a heart attack, but we actually don't, because if you did that to a woman, then you'd probably crack her ribs. It's just that you don't realize that most of the times you see just men being done that to them on medical TV shows because they're trying to avoid showing women's breasts on TV. We don't realize that we lack a big picture approach until we basically have to input the data onto an algorithm and we realize, oh, I only have men. Why is it that I only have men? Overall, it's easier to see data when you're inputting data sets. We think that that myopic is wrong. The last thing I want to talk about is the other argument that they gave us, this whole thing about the inability to understand and how in congressional hearings, individuals tell us about how is it, individuals were unable to understand how is it that Facebook makes money or how Google search algorithms so on. Maybe old white Republicans were unable to understand it, but I wager that most people in this room could probably explain it in under 30 seconds, as would most 11-year-olds that also have a Facebook. I wager then that this means that it's not that humans are unable to understand, but rather that individuals need to be replaced. We reckon that in our world, we get more tech-savvy people in Congress. They also can't have it both ways. They can't have people who simultaneously exploit this to brainwash in the campaign trail and also are incapable of understanding. Before I move on, does anyone have a POI? No?
Assume huge data sets are exclusive to the government bench.
Well, I think that first of all, the capacity of Excel to actually manage big data is quite smaller. But also, and here's the really big thing, right, is that when a code is broken, a machine or an algorithm is able to fix it. Whereas if you have 10,000 data points and one of them is kind of weird, you just do not have, as a person, enough will to look through every single one of them and find the one that meant that your statistical analysis yielded the result that it got. For those kinds of analysis, you do need something slightly bigger than yourself. You do need technology. So then, onto my next argument, onto my actual sort of argumentative extension, right? And that's the idea that policy making, directly comparing with OO, and their Excel spreadsheets is just much better. 3 broad reasons for this. Firstly, we do have the capacity to analyze trends in a much better way, mostly because of the things that I already just mentioned, right? That just the capacity of individuals to go through the thousands and thousands and thousands of data points that is required for statistical analysis that is significant and identify errors or statistical variances is just considerably limited. When you have to go through thousands of lines of code in order to identify the one that yielded a statistical missense, then I think that that's something that machines are much better able to identify than humans. Secondly, because of what I mentioned, it's not just that machines are impersonal, as OG tells you, but rather that human beings are capable of making excuses, that we like to think of ourselves as good people, and therefore we're really unlikely to accept errors in judgment. And the last thing that I want to talk about is also the fact that people just don't understand statistics. We like to use them because they make us feel safe, but at the end of the day, we're not as capable of understanding as we are understanding machine learning. At the end of the day, I just think that we're much less able to identify issues when it comes packaged in the myopia of humans than when it comes on the raw facts of machines, both close in government.
Okay, I'm actually going to pause this here because I think this extension speech does some quite interesting things. So Viha's going to run through what we're going to credit the extension with above opening government. Remember what I said about how it's very important to basically figure out exactly what is added. So this is it. Viha's going to run through, and then if people have questions, we can do them immediately after this.
Yeah. Okay. So the thing with Lucia's speech that we must remember is that while a lot of the things she does say are fairly similar to the premises that OG goes for, especially in the latter half of the speech when she talks about extension, a lot of the rebuttals that she makes in the first half of the speech are fairly valuable. What are some of these things? I think some of these things include a discussion about why machine learning is better at spotting biases than humans are. Whether it is because there's statistical significance, because there's a larger number of data points to work with, or that people are often inherently bad at identifying ingrained sexism, racism, or homophobia around them, and therefore the data is the kind of nudge that pushes them to want to look into these things, or that people are myopic and lack the big picture view of why things are, or the things we see are the way they are. So the examples are like chest compressions on men versus women. These are all great examples and analysis to prove that machine learning has the ability to identify and spot biases and problems better than humans possibly could. This is analysis of that is done in rebuttals that she doesn't explicitly flag out as CG value contribution. She doesn't name any of this as extension, but it is still incredibly valuable and should be credited to CG as value. The thing that she does craft as her extension at the end of her speech is actually basically a lot of the same premises and the same conclusions that what OG already brought to the table. Things like machines can identify better, they have the ability to go through the information at a greater speed and efficiency. All of these things, while are the things that she claims are her extension, probably should not be given value or credit to CG, but instead should be given to OG. Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks, Viha. Beiqi, do you have anything to add to just Lucia's speech?
Yep, I also think that it's very similar, even though they use different examples. If they are using the same line of reasoning, they should not be credited as new material per se, because I think that, so for instance, I think in PM speech especially, it was already highlighted, for instance, in terms of if you are able to identify that we are more biased towards like black neighborhoods, for instance, and this is being used for a separate example that we are biased against women, we don't have enough women on certain platforms. I think that given that they are actually using the same line of reasoning, I don't think that you can credit this new example so much more to what the opening has already offered in terms of the same line of reasoning, just different example, and how they use that if you identify a problem, you're able to solve it, and the faster you identify it, the faster you solve it. So I think that that's the point to just take note. Yep.
I actually don't think that that was the same reasoning necessarily. I think she's actually giving reasons why we solve that problem and giving a separate reason for why the problem exists in the first place. So the problem she flags with the women example isn't a problem necessarily with bias, but also a problem with missing data sets and missing and just not having that appropriate information. And the context in which she uses the example, I think, is sufficiently distinct from OG's context of over policing black neighborhoods that I think we should be able to credit her with the line of logic as well. Okay, so that's it for me. Do people have any questions about the CG extension? Okay, so if no questions about the CG extension, there was something that I needed to say before we start the closing opposition extension. And this is an explanation of how to judge principled claims versus practical claims and what exactly principled claims and practical claims are. Okay, so I just want to say a couple of things about principled claims first that don't necessarily relate to judging, but just exist as a way for you to think about principles. The first is that principal arguments can't all be lumped together. Not all principal arguments are the same. I think it's very tempting for judges to say, it was a principled argument and leave it as that, without realizing that principled arguments and the way they're made are actually extremely distinct from each other. The second is that principled arguments are not better or worse than any other sort of argument. They're just an argument, right? Like you can't just say a principle automatically comes over a practical or vice versa. The third is that principled arguments are usually not separate from a discussion of outcomes. Because even when you are running what we normally consider to be practical arguments, you do also have quite a lot of explanation for why those outcomes that you are arguing for are morally significant, or why they're beneficial or good. So for example, we get this particular policy on our side, but then you do have to rely on moral explanations for why that particular policy is a good thing to have, or why you think it might be a beneficial thing for society, or why you think it might reinforce some kind of good norm. So I guess the most obvious example of this is the very practical argument that we benefit X number of people from this group on our side. Very often teams also respond, yes, maybe Gov benefits these people, but we benefit a different group of people, and they are more important because they are a vulnerable minority. I'm sure you've all heard this argument, the disenfranchised minority extension is everywhere nowadays. That is already in and of itself a way of asking you to make the trade-off using a moral argument as opposed to a consequential one. You are no longer relying on consequences the moment you bring in these kinds of moral and practical considerations. So don't think that there is a hard distinction between moral, like non-consequentialist arguments and consequentialist arguments. The distinction honestly doesn't really exist in many cases. Last of all, you should probably also have a burden on teams who run practical arguments to explain the benefits of their things, right? Like, I don't think they can get away with just saying, we get X outcome without explaining why it is good. Okay, so when you're judging principles, you can think of principles as doing things, right? I keep asking things like, what does this argument do? Or what does this rebuttal do, right? Does it mitigate? Does it impact? Like, what exactly is it trying to do here? With principles, it's the same thing. What are teams trying to prove with this moral argument that they're bringing forth? There are two options. Number one, are they trying to prove an absolute right that can never be contravened, even if it leads to immensely harmful consequences? An example of this might be the right to be free from torture, if you are doing a torture versus national security kind of debate, right? You might say the right to be free from torture is such an absolute right that even if it means 100 people die from a bomb a terrorist has planted somewhere, we should not torture this person, like hard limit. This is an argument that has a tremendously high argumentative burden. The reason it has a high argumentative burden is because you must prove that this is an absolute right, meaning that it must apply in every single scenario, and that under no circumstances an outcome can outweigh it. The high argumentative burden also comes with a high payoff. It's one of those high risk, high reward strategies. If you are able to prove an absolute right, then that's it. The other team just cannot outweigh you on a consequentialist basis because you have proven this to be an absolute right already. Okay? More commonly, what teams try to do, but this is an all or nothing thing. You can't halfway prove an absolute right. If you halfway prove an absolute right, you're not proving it's absolute. You're just, it's like 0 or 100 essentially, right? Like if you can't just be like, it is an absolute right, but it's only true some of the time, because that's not what an absolute right means. Okay, but more commonly, what teams try to do is they try to prove a sort of threshold. They try to basically say, is this right important enough that we should only outweigh it in times of tremendous harm or tremendous benefit? And they usually try to pitch it to like a sufficiently high level, and they say, okay, the other side cannot do enough to outweigh this. Now, if they're trying to prove a threshold, the argumentative burden is lower. It's much easier to prove than trying to say there is an absolute right. But at the same time, it is also easier to outweigh on the other side, so long as they show the consequences are sufficiently good or sufficiently bad. Everyone okay so far about what principles do and what the argumentative burdens of principles are? Okay, so if people are good so far, you also need to consider how well a principle argument is proven, okay? How do you prove a principle argument? Same as any other argument, you do need to credit analysis, and principle arguments should have analysis. And principled arguments that don't have analysis and are just fluffy and fake are fluffy and fake and not real arguments, okay? So same as any other argument, you have analysis. The difference is that your analysis is now derived from some kind of philosophical or ethical basis. It's not any more special than arguing supply and demand, which is also a specialized area of knowledge, right? It is just a different area or topic. you need to, so I think normally what you look for when you're crediting principal arguments, do they explain where the source of the right comes from? Where does this right derive from? Is it deriving because we believe there is some kind of human dignity that we must preserve? Does it derive from the right of life, right to life? Does it derive from the maximization of choice? Why exactly do we value this right? Where does it come from? Second of all, you probably want to do some logic here, right? You probably want to explain how you think this right functions and why exactly it is important that we have this right. Third of all, you probably want to explain significance within the round, what your principal argument is doing. So again, this goes back to the absolute versus relative kind of thing. Explain what exactly you are thinking that your principal argument is going to achieve. Normally, a lot of people also make principled arguments using intuition pumps and analogies. So they say so they explain like the moral intuitions that we all have. I might, for example, explain this argument that movements should be able to use violence when they are advocating for their outcome. And I might do this by explaining this in terms of the principle of self-defense on an individual level. I might say, if Viha comes at me with a knife, I would be perfectly equipped to defend myself against her because I have an absolute right to life that should not be taken away by circumstances outside of my control or blah, 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 blah. So I would then use this moral intuition to expand it and explain how it then probably covers a movement. So this is what I mean by saying many people try to prove principles using these kinds of intuition pumps. The thing about intuition pumps is that it is overly easy to rely on them. So you must make sure that when you are judging, right, you do need to make sure the team is also explaining the intuition pump. Here's what this pump does. It helps by shifting the moral intuitions of the judge to your logic by using analogies. This is how logic is applicable in real life, right? People tell you something that's moral or not moral in society, and if it is sufficiently well explained, you might be persuaded to believe that stealing is moral, or you might be persuaded to believe that stealing is immoral. Same thing, you need to be open to having your moral intuitions shifted. You need to be open as a judge to considering that all of these arguments are also valid arguments in this particular instance. Just be open to considering principled arguments if they are well explained. So you do need to see if they actually prove the principle as well though. Okay, so what do you do when you have a fake principled case and how do you spot it? I guess if you just have smart sounding words that mean nothing and there is like no logic there, that to me is a sign of a fake principled case. There's just an appeal to authority that says we have always done this, therefore we should do this. That is not really a real argument. And if sometimes you have like this utilitarian argument that's hidden as a moral principle, people might say, oh, we have a moral obligation to help these people, and this is our principled stance for this debate. Obviously, this moral obligation to help will then become dependent on the arguments of whether or not you actually do help them. So it's not an argument that necessarily advances you in your case independently of the outcomes that you are also advancing. Okay, so how do you weigh two principles against each other? Two rights can exist at the same time. If you prove that your right exists, it doesn't mean that the other right doesn't exist. For example, in this debate, maybe the right to privacy exists, but the right to security also exists. So then you must weigh these principles against each other. They can both exist at the same time. Which particular right is more important? If they don't give you the metric for this, check for implicit concessions, check for consistency. Last of all, check for analysis of argument and which team proves their right better. Okay, so sorry, that was quite a lot. Are people okay with principles so far? Okay, so if people have no questions about judging principles, I'm now going to play the member of opposition speech. And this is quite important because the member of opposition speech does some funky things as well. Oh, also the member of opposition speech cuts off halfway, but that's okay because I've inserted a slide with the sentence that was cut off. So just follow the slide.
Thanks, Lucia. Can I now invite the member of opposition, Xie?
Testing. This is not a debate about whether big data is intrinsically good or bad. It is a debate about whether it is good or bad, specifically in the context of policy making by the state. Consequently, two lines of extension. Firstly, why this policy undermines democratic transparency and accountability. Second, why it undermines our ability to regulate the developmental trajectory of big data. Before that, a few points of rebuttal against CG. The first claim we get from CG is that humans can give reasons for their judgments, but sometimes those are bad reasons. For example, if a prosecutor or a judge thinks that women are just less capable. That is true, but note here that when people give bad reasons, critically we can rebut those bad reasons and suggest reasons why we disagree. That is the premise of public debate, and that is the premise of good, healthy democracy. The difference is, given that AI can't give reasons for its actions, as we'll explain later on, we think that that crucial move of being able to respond to bad reasons can't even occur in the first place. Second, we're told that humans don't realize when they don't have enough data, and that the volume of data is sometimes just too small. We'll respond to this in extension. Third, we're told we just need more tech-savvy people in Congress to regulate the stuff. The problem is that it's quite rare to get very tech-savvy people in Congress, noting that there is often data scientists have a very different profile to the profile of a politician. Data scientists like to hedge their statements. They like to tell you when it is legitimate to draw an inference from the data, whereas politicians like to use sort of reductive sound bites in order to promote particular policies. Consequently, we just don't think they're a good fit or are likely to get elected to Congress. Finally, we're told people don't understand statistics. That is true, but data scientists understand statistics. Notably, both people and data scientists understand big data less than they understand statistics. Okay, first point of extension. Why does this undermine democratic transparency? 3 reasons. Reason number 1, garbage in, garbage out. AI operates by extracting patterns from existing data sets. The problem is the data set that you use to train your model is sometimes a bad data set. For example, given that in the US there is a large amount of over-policing of the African-American community, it's very likely we pick up a large amount of crime from this community just because of the racist way in which police activity is conducted. Consequently, when you train your data to spot patterns, your model to spot patterns in the data, you're likely to assume, as the computer model doesn't know that this data set is incomplete, that there is just more crime amongst the African-American community, even if that is not generally true. The consequence of this is that you end up having a model that predicts that these are people who are more likely to commit crime or more likely to reoffend. Note the difference between this and a scenario in which a human is making a judgment. We know that humans make biased judgments and have prejudices in the way they produce judgment. The problem is that artificial intelligence and big data carries with it a veneer of objectivity because we think it is making fair judgments, even though the data set on which it is based is not fair. The second problem is the problem of overfitting. This responds to the closing government extension. Note here, merely throwing more data at a model does not necessarily make that model more accurate. Any data scientist will tell you there is a big problem with overfitting of a model. To illustrate this problem, most of us learn in science class to draw lines of best fit through complicated mazes of dots on a diagram. The problem is, how closely should your line fit those dots? Well, you could draw, in principle, a line which connects all of the dots, but that will not give you any meaningful trend out of the data because your model isn't capturing the trend, your model is capturing the errors in the data. The problem is, we don't know when our model is underfitting the data or overfitting the data, which means that it does not have the predictive power that this government bench thinks it has. The third problem is the problem of the black box, or the unexplainability problem. And I think this also responds to CG's material. It is not just politicians who don't understand big data and the models that they use to predict facts. Data scientists themselves also often don't understand the reasons why certain predictions are made. How do machines, how does machine learning or artificial neural networks, how do they operate? They operate by extracting patterns from data and learning to make accurate predictions. So for example, what you do is you initialize a bunch of weights and biases, you make a prediction based on those weights and biases, you look at how well the prediction fits the data, then you go back and you tweak your weights and biases, you make the prediction again until your prediction becomes more accurate. The problem is, at no point are you giving a reason why you're making certain predictions. The way that the machine makes a prediction is an initialization pattern flows through a bunch of activation sequences in your neural network, and then you decide that then you produce a prediction at the end of it without giving you a reason why that was the prediction that you made. In contrast, humans can give reasons. So to give you an example of this, no thank you. If I am denied a mortgage, for example, because I have a poor credit score, I can ask, why was my credit score so poor? And the person can tell me that's because you made a particular purchase at a certain point or you defaulted on a loan at a certain point in history. The AI can't tell you that. All it does is it scans your profile, a series of weights and biases activate in the network, and it says, do not give this person a mortgage, without giving you any reasons why that is true. Why does this matter? Because the premise of democracy is that we deliberate upon problems through the use of publicly accessible reason. We think this is the basis on which democratic governments gain legitimacy. Note that governments wield tremendous power over our lives. They are licensed to use violence to take property, to limit our individual freedom. That use of violence is only legitimate if we can understand the reasons for which policies are taken and argue against them if need be. A couple of nuances here. One, we think that we're happy for AI to be used in the private sector. We just think there's a special obligation for governments specifically to be accountable in the way they deploy their policy. And second, we think that given that political apathy is at an all-time high, it's going to get even worse if the average person thinks that they can't understand, they can't participate in democracy because there's just no way they could understand like the complexity of the machinery that is involved. This will exacerbate those political problems. That is a bad thing. Any POI from closing?
Yeah,
nope.
So
yeah.
This seems symmetric unless you can prove to me that humans do have perfect knowledge of what would be good data.
That's not true. We think like humans don't have perfect knowledge, but they can give reasons for why they do things, and we can protest those reasons if we disagree with them. With a machine, you are literally just outsourcing the decision-making to it without any ability to hold that. We think that what makes big data good or bad is how well we can regulate its developmental trajectory. Governments are not perfect at this, but they are the only viable regulators. This policy undermines this. One, because now governments are purchasing and deploying big data to be used. Regulations often drive up the costs of using these technologies, which means they are incentivized to not implement regulation which is as harsh. Secondly, when there are problems with the way that these models operate, there's a strong incentive on governments to cover up these sorts of scandals. Because instead of checking the corporations that deploy these models, you now have every incentive to prevent your own government experiencing scandal by being accused of a data leakage. This is very bad. This means that big data doesn't get regulated. That means all the harms of privacy and data vulnerability are exacerbated. Consequently, what matters in this debate is not whether data is good or bad objectively, but whether it is good or bad as used by governments. And those are reasons why you should oppose.
Cool. So before we get into the whip speeches, Viha's going to do a quick chat through about what MO can be credited with, and then we'll do questions on MO and then do whips.
Yeah. So in this MO speech, he actually does quite a bit. So some of those things are fairly repetitive of what happens in OO. For instance, the claims of bad data going into the AI will result in bad results coming out of it. He illustrates as garbage in, garbage out as a principle. Those things are not new, even though they are slightly better illustrated in the kinds of examples he gives. The things that are new are maybe 2 or 3, 4. One is a better explanation of this black box and unexplainability, and who are the people who are likely to understand what is happening, and how people interpret this information that comes from these trend analysis that happens in the data. That translates into an argument about how governments gain legitimacy, and a principal argument about government duty, and how the way they gain their legitimacy is built on the people having reason and understanding of this AI data, and ability to hold their governments accountable, or to protest, or to appeal certain decisions. That is a principal argument that comes from CO that builds upon the idea that the debate should not be seen from the lens of whether the AI is good or bad in and of itself, but good or bad in how governments use this data and use this AI information. That part of it is the newest part of the CO extension. A lot of the other things are adding to the claims about accountability mechanisms, about whether or not politicians are different or similar to data scientists. All of those things add to the end goal that they were going for in CO, which is that principle, the principle that the government should not gain legitimacy, or the government principally gains has the inability to prove legitimacy when the people don't understand the information that they get from this AI data. Yeah.
Okay, Awesome, thanks Viha. So you can kind of see this here as well, right? So CEOs basically reframed the entire debate and said it's not so much about the actual outcomes of the policy. The policy might be better, it might be worse. We just think it's bad, that they can't be held accountable because this is about governments making decisions. I'm going to add one more thing to this argument about government legitimacy and duty to emphasize that it's especially important because governments and government policy wields great power over our lives. Okay, so this is like a reason why it's especially urgent and important that we understand the reasons behind those decisions, because we feel that people should not be arbitrarily affected without having the ability to then challenge how they're being affected. Okay, do people have anything to add with regards to the CEO's members' opposition speech? Probably one more thing here about how just having more information and more data doesn't mean that the AI is better able to interpret the information. Okay. Okay, so if there are no more questions or thoughts about the member of opposition speech, just some quick notes about judging diagonals and whip speeches. Number one, whip speeches can't bring in new substantive material, meaning material that's going to change the direction of the CG case or the CO case. They need to stick to the same direction. So if you think about it in terms of rebuttals, remember I said there were rebuttals that challenged and then rebuttals that provided counterclaims for various cases. Basically, they can do rebuttals that challenge. They probably cannot do rebuttals that offer new counterclaims that are then elaborated only in whip. Those kinds of counterclaims, if they exist, must be in extension as well. I guess the third thing to point out is that if you're judging long diagonals, it's pretty much very similar to judging DLO versus the OG. It's about a lack of response. So do not have random preferences for opening or closing. Only evaluate the debate as it was said. Do not go by the role of each team. Don't say it is OG's role to do this and they did this, therefore they win over CO or vice versa. Do not make arbitrary adjustments to deal with the lack of opportunity to engage. Judges should compare arguments, and this goes back to Vedika's question all the way at the start. Judges should compare arguments based only on what was said in the debate. If a judge is unable to assess based only on what was said, they need to use only the smallest set of reasonable assumptions possible, and they must be able to explain these. So for example, suppose teams just don't engage with each other at all, you would then have to rely on how well the analysis was made and judge how much they engage with each other, even if the engagement is minimal. Do not invent arguments, do not rebut arguments for teams, do not complete arguments for teams. So for example, in the LO speech, LO gave a lot of examples, she asked a lot of questions. Those questions made you think about the things that OG was saying, but you should not complete those questions to become a full argument on LO's behalf. She just raised questions. She didn't say what the answer to those questions should be, one way or another. So do not complete the arguments, evaluate only what was said, evaluate only what was done. This is the other reason why it's super useful to just have a summary table of what we're crediting each team with, because that is an easy way for you to look back at your notes at the end of the debate and be like, okay, here is how I am crediting this material over this other material. I'm gonna play all the whip speeches now.
Opening government. Secondly, CEO. Okay, I'm going to summarize this debate by going through the teams in increasing order of relevance to the debate. So firstly, OG, who have no arguments. Secondly, CEO, who have no extension. And lastly, OO, who have no meaningful stance. Okay, so first thing, opening government. They have a series of issues in that they lack most of the mechanisms that we gave you in our extension. That is to say, we explained things like why going through more data is likely to lead you to better conclusions, because you can test more hypotheses, you can compare different things. Just simply knowing more things about the world means we have a better understanding of in what ways we might want to change the world and in what ways those changes are likely to better the world. Secondly, we're able to explain that we are able to uncover trends in ways which we might never be able to do in opposition's work. That is because sometimes we don't have a good understanding of why two disparate issues might be linked. What big data is able to do is to tell us that these two entirely unrelated things, indeed many of the things that opposition complained about, so things like the effect of, for example, wealth and poverty on crime rates. Big data can take these two separate sets of information, combine them, spit out a graph and says, hey, these two things seem correlated, you should care about them. That's a benefit that we gave you in CG that wasn't present in OG. And lastly, in terms of the understanding of issues, this is also incredibly important because computers, crucially, don't actually need to understand what any of the numbers mean. All they need to know is that this number goes up or this number goes down when it is prodded by this other number in this way or this way. And it's very easy then for us to make lots of different models and reach lots of different conclusions that we would otherwise be unable to do. Next, closing opposition. So I'll try and deal with all the stuff that was new first of all. So they said, look, we can't rebut AI, but we can rebut bad reasons politicians give us. I just think this argument is relatively symmetric because firstly, it assumes that we get a similar level of decision justification on both sides. In many cases, politicians just like, we did the policy, why? Because we did some stats that said it was good. And I don't think the stats are any easier to understand than a spit out from some algorithm. The only response to this we get is, but data scientists do understand statistics from closing opposition. Now, if this is true, I feel like this undermines some of the things opening opposition said about how no one can understand any of this data ever. But if data scientists can understand statistics in Excel, I don't understand why it's that much difficult when it's in MATLAB or R. For example, the only real extension here is the idea that AI is uniquely difficult to understand for some reason that they didn't really explain. It might be because closing opposition don't understand how AI works. And indeed, a running theme on the opposition bench is to explain a bunch of really bad ways to set up AI and then complain that the conclusions that that AI might draw would also be bad. Indeed, I suspect it would, and that's why people would not set up those models in those ways. They tell us that politicians aren't particularly tech savvy. I mean, sure, so they're bad at statistics, they're bad at AI, etc. That's why Boris Johnson doesn't himself set all of these policies. He gets advised by a huge bureau of scientists and civil servants who would be able to understand these models and therefore would be able to draw meaningful conclusions. Next, they tell us about input problems. I'll talk about this in a second, but the short answer is that input problem is at best symmetric, but also we make it better. Next, they say justifications. Again, I just don't think this is true. I think the AI could say, no, I'm not telling you a reason why I'm not giving you a loan, much in the same way that any loan provider could. Or we could say, press the button on the AI that says, give a reason, and the AI will say, well, your score on this particular index was too low. Your score on this index was too high. And it can very easily, with a few extra lines of code, give a short printout for the justification for which parameters you were too high or too low on. And it would take all of 5 seconds to, write a little plugin to spit it out in Microsoft Word to explain it to someone. And I think a lot of the responses to the democratic accountability stuff are also similar for these reasons. I think that very easily different political parties or different non-governmental organizations could create different models and say, look, here, our model gets a different result if we change these input parameters. Justify why you're using this model. Indeed, this is something we've seen a lot, in particular with regards to the coronavirus pandemic and how people have changed their predictions and changed their policy platforms on the basis of different data being called out by other people. And the last stuff about private-public, I think the distinction is artificial. Lots of the examples they used about denying people mortgages are also true of private organizations, which also have large amounts of control over our lives. So the distinction seems super arbitrary. Anyway, let's talk about OO and the bits of CO, therefore, that were derivative. The first problem is that their overall stance is incredibly unclear because they seem to only want to talk about using AI and only want to talk about AI being the final decision maker. That's not the case, and that's not the stance of any team on government. The AI will spit us out a bunch of data, a bunch of graphs, and it will still have that basic sense checking of a human being signing that into law or deciding whether this policy actually happens, which means in the worst cases of op, where the AI says, hey guys, the best way to control poverty would be kill all the poor people. It's not like we just have an automatic button from the AI going into policy making. Obviously, a human being is going to sense check this at some point. In terms of the awareness issue of data, I also think this is flawed. I think people don't necessarily know that they are racist. They believe what they're doing is sensible. I think it's asserted that people have the common sense to know that they are being racist and that we can change this in a meaningful way. It's also asserted that people have the common sense to know that they're missing important bits of data. Indeed, that only works if I know that I should be expecting more data, which is a primary benefit of AI, which is able to tell us what data we can correlate and what things we can work out without even knowing what those things mean or why they work together. I'll take opening if they're still around.
Yeah. The CG's case has entirely been about why having information is good. This, it is not at all exclusive. Opposition can use those models as well. The only difference is you have to support them replacing human judgments as prescribed to you by the motion.
I mean, the motion says that we want to use more data and less arbitrary human judgment. We still support some human judgments, but we prefer that those human judgments were informed by more and better big data gathering. The next response to a lot of OO stuff is a lot of that stuff about bad modeling also falls slowly away from the debate. As we use these models more, we have incentives to collect more data, to collect better data. And crucially, it's way easier to spot when there are problems with this data. Firstly, because with big data sets, small trends become more statistically significant. A 0.5% deviation from what we expect is easier and able to be proven to be true if I have 1 million pieces of data as opposed to just 10. I remember all of the data. I'm able to manipulate and compare different data sources. It's easier to correct because I can review my code, compare it to other models, and multiple organizations are likely to do this. And so I think the last set of things they tell us about bad modeling are basically just reasons why people might make bad models. They might have poor sense checking. They might have no ability to understand that data is problematic. But all of these things are also true of any set of statistics we want to introduce in the status quo, but they lack the corrective mechanisms that Lucia gave you to explain why this gets better in the long run. For those reasons, very proud to propose.
Okay,
the first big problem only come out in, yes? Oh, okay, cool. I'm going to do two things in the speech. First, I'm going to respond to the main mechanisms on the Gov bench, which, to be fair, did only come out in the CG. And second of all, I'm going to tell you why we take the opposition bench, because we proved to you that accountability increases on our side of the house. The first big problem with the Gov bench is the POI that OO gave, which is the motion says you would significantly replace human judgments, the emphasis there being significant. Now, I'm not sure exactly what it means. I would hazard it's somewhere in the region of 80 to 90%, and maybe CG gets away with saying that in the remaining 10% of cases, we will have a president, say Trump, hypothetically sign off on these things before they become law. The problem is that the one useful contribution that opening government gave is framing this as a case of wicked problems, where literally any misplaced decision would have a catastrophic impact on someone's life. So I just think net in 10% of cases, you would have a human being doing a sense check on the Gov side, and in 90% of cases, we would likely do a terrible thing to someone's life. There are three other things that closing governments say. The first is that it is easier to spot bias. For example, you can test a hypothesis about the gender divide if we see 4 men employed for every 1 woman. There is a vicious circle here that they do not get out of. Because in order to make an unbiased decision going forward, in other words, to extract bias from a pattern that you've seen, you need to already know what that bias is. So you cannot at the same time use a model that says we will use this information to spot instances of bias, while at the same time using knowledge earlier on of that bias to try and ensure that biased decisions are taken out there. So as an illustration of this, the model can't simultaneously detect bias by saying, well, there are 4 men to 1 woman, so there is some gendered hiring going on here, and at the same time be able to distance themselves from a conclusion that says women are just less likely to want to be in the workplace from an extrapolation of that same data. In other words, this part of the CG case just doesn't work with the rest of the stuff they've talked about. The next thing they say is that all we need to know is that numbers, when prodded, move in a certain direction. Not true. We unfortunately need to know a bit more than that. We need to know why the numbers move in a certain direction. Otherwise, the prodding, if done in the future, won't work. And that's where the stuff we tell you about not being able to have understanding of those reasons, no thank you, means that we just don't really get that. So yeah, just because something's happened in the past doesn't mean it's going to happen again in the future. Finally, CG say that human beings are just kind of bad people, and they make excuses and they refuse to acknowledge that they've been biased in the past. Yeah, we're probably okay with that. There are a few things here that matter, though. The first is that usually the researchers and scientists, social scientists or otherwise, or even government think tanks who are trying to eliminate bias, they aren't the accused, so they don't feel like they have a stake in not calling things out. They're quite happy to do so. Second of all, it's much more likely that we can convince people they've been unconsciously biased when we can walk them through it, when we can show them 10, 12, 15 data sets which all say the same thing, because that's an illusion of having many confirming sources, as opposed to a button which just spits out a single conclusion. in a way that a human being is not likely to understand. So I think what this means is you're either going to have a mix of biased and unbiased decision making and a mix of valid and invalid conclusions about the state of the world, but all of this trapped under the destructive veneer of thinking that the science and the data is getting it right. That is a world in which apathy comes about. That is a world in which there's less accountability for the reasons that we will now talk about. No, thank you. So Darren tells you that democratic accountability is going to be destroyed for a number of reasons. What are CG's responses to this? The first response is to say that with a few lines of code, the big data can also give a reason as to why you were, for example, rejected for a loan. Let me get this straight. With a few lines of code, they think that they're going to be able to capture all those benefits that their GovBench is entirely about, all those numbers floating around in some weird computer space thing. And in a few lines of code, they're going to be able to design a plugin that works. I mean, those can be ridiculously messy and long lines of code, if that's even going to be possible. The better response they give is that this is symmetric because it's actually objectively pretty hard to question government decisions. So I'm going to make that comparison very clear. When you're trying to apply for an immigration visa in a country, say this one, there is in the status quo a rubric that's based on things like whether you have a job and whether you speak the language. And presumably, the reason we weight some points in a points-based immigration system the way it is because we have some information done traditionally through statistical methods like Excel as to which ones make you more likely to succeed as an immigrant or make you more likely to contribute to the economy. Now, is that fair and is that the best way of doing things? We're not sure. But at least you as an immigrant have the ability to question that in the future, or groups are able to point to existing research and say, hey, maybe this factor is overvalued, this factor is undervalued. This goes for literally any government decision that is rubric-based. Who's that from? Hello? Is that POI?
Sorry, OG, yeah.
Nah, it's fine. You had nothing to debate anyway. So any rubric-based system is one that someone else can interrogate because the rubric exists. Yeah, go ahead.
So surely the AI will just publish the rubric that it uses to assign these things and the indices it gave you for the various factors it cares about.
You see, if you're getting to the point where an easily understandable rubric, an applicable rubric is going to be produced, you're actually much more like what the op bench cares about now, i.e. you're putting huge constraints on how you're using the data and the fact that it must be intelligible to a human being, whereas a lot of your case is about taking out the flaws of human beings for all their flawed humanness. Finally, they say, but companies do the same evil things too. And you know what? We don't really like that, which is why one of our parts of our case is that governments should clamp down on companies who do stupid shit, and there was no response to that. That is criminal from closing government, and because they haven't responded to that, not only do they not have a chance, because they've also wasted their POI, they should lose to us on that. Because Darren tells you why regulation is impossible. It's impossible because anything which hurts the big data industry is likely to hurt a government's ability to deliver on its political promises, assuming that it does even help them deliver in the first place. This is important because governments are arguably the only force large enough to combat abuse technology on a large scale. In other words, it is unique. But going back to the original discussion about accountability, the reason the private sector is different is because governments have a special obligation to people. The special obligation lies in the fact that they're coercing them to live in a state or in any state at all, and by virtue of that coercion and that tyranny, they have an obligation to do some very basic things, like make sure that they have housing and make sure that they have healthcare. And at the point where you're out of order, the point where you're denied that healthcare, denied that housing for no intelligible reason, that's unaccountability in its worst form. That's a world in which you are completely unable to hold your politicians to account, to challenge the reasons why you've been discriminated against, or to challenge your place within that society. That is a society that isn't fair and it isn't accountable, and it's definitely not democratic. For all of these reasons, we are very proud to stand in closing opposition.
Okay, guys. So in the interest of time, we're just going to get Beiqi to run through what both whips add to the debate, and then Viha's going to do a quick discussion of diagonals. And then we'll do all questions towards the end.
Okay, so I'll start out with government whip. So there are three main contributions. Firstly, what are the benefits of the big data? Why big data are unique? Secondly, why AI can give outcomes just like how humans can give outcomes. Lastly, how can the harms of AI and big data be mitigated as a whole? So the first premise that they gave in terms of big data, the first kind of benefit is that they can link things together, a lot of different concepts, wealth, poverty, and crime rates, such that you can create a correlation. The second thing that add on to the analysis is that you can have multiple models to check different factors into influencing. It means that you are able to check a lot of factors at once to explain how certain factors play different weights in terms of arriving at a certain outcome. The last part is that at the last part of GovWhip's speech is this idea that you need a big enough data set to actually spot a lot of smaller trends that smaller data sets cannot achieve. Okay, so moving on to the second key lump is this idea that the AI does give outcome. So is this example of why was the credit mortgage being denied? So AI sets like how data scientists program them, they can just be programmed to churn out certain small lines of code to suggest that because you have a too low a credit rating for a certain set. So AI can also give certain answers and reasonings. It is not like what the member of opposition claimed that they cannot explain at all. So I think that's the response. Moving on to the last part is how harms can be mitigated. So there are mainly two folds. Firstly is that data scientists can check AI, and as time goes on, you can improve the data set as you spot certain errors, you realize that certain data points are faulty, extending from the members' analysis. The second part is that a lot of potential parties political parties can still rely on tech-savvy people to actually check each other's model. The kind of debate can still happen, which means that the models are not, like what member of opposition claimed, that tech-savvy people are not elected to the office and therefore they cannot reap the benefit of checking certain models. So I think that was the response directly addressing the member of opposition. So that's all for the government whip. Would anyone like to add on anything before I move on to opposition whip?
Yeah, perhaps just on the last thing you said, I think it was that political parties can run different types of models and then compare models against each other. So not necessarily that individual tech-savvy people in government who would be checking each other, but that political parties have incentives, democratic incentives to do this.
Yep, so you do not need the politicians to be actually tech-savvy to begin with. Yeah. Okay, so moving on to opposition whip. So opposition whip mainly is, firstly, is this idea mainly got to do with like, how do you check biases? So on this premise, there are a few responses. One is that I think that our opposition whip essentially first tries to argue that you cannot use external knowledge to correct the kind of bias, because certain bias are hard to spot. It is not transparent and easy to understand. So you can't use external knowledge and have the kind of like model that the CG claims that you can check what are the errors in what areas and then remove those errors. The second piece of response is that, look, external observers can observe and call out bias, but so that people can actually deal with the internal bias, can be convinced of the internal bias. So that directly deals with CG. It means that if you are able to spot certain biases that humans make, it is easier, and you're convinced that they have internalized bias, it is easier for you to then deal with the bias, easier to spot them, and therefore deal with them. I think the last part is about this rubric-based system. So I think that this directly addresses in terms of like the kind of like, the example that was being used is this idea of embassy. So the idea that, look, if the AI can churn out certain responses, one of a few lines, I think that this is not so charitable in terms of reading, but relying much more in terms of intuition power by saying that, look, this is just a few lines of codes. So you can't possibly believe a few lines of codes. I think that although this is a valid contribution in like relying on your intuition palm to think of AI as a complicated thing that you couldn't possibly understand, and just a few lines of code will not help you to understand the reasoning. But I think moving beyond that, the response that really came from our opposition group that breaks the that makes it more clearer is this idea that the rubric-based system that's easy to comprehend, such that there are first yes or no things. It means that you are easier to question them, and this is the benefit that's exclusive to opposition. AI can't claim it on-site proposition.
Okay, just a couple of things to add, I think, about closing opposition before Viha moves on to diagonals. I think the few lines of code thing is a direct response to the closing government whip, when closing government whip actually says it's very easy to add on an explanatory function to AI. It only needs a few lines of code. So the response from CO about few lines of code is not so much to say that it's impossible to understand, but rather saying that it is extremely difficult to use only a few lines of code to add on that explanatory potential, precisely because of all the extension material about the black box unexplainability problem. So that's what the few lines of code response is, I think, tackling, rather than the argument that it's impossible to understand. It's saying it's going to be very difficult to code it such such that it is understandable and explainable due to the extension material. The second is just an addition to the extension material. I think extension material actually also talks about government democratic apathy in terms of in terms of an outcome, as well as governments being increasingly unable to regulate AI, both of which I think are still quite important in the debate that we didn't discuss a huge amount. So just be aware that they are there. I will add them into this. Okay, Viha, do you want to take over?
Yeah. So this thing is, my bit is just going to look at exactly what the diagonals look like and how we weigh out the diagonals both in the short cross and the long cross of the debate. So starting with the short cross and the OO-CG comparison, I think this is fairly easy to compare because CG's real value contribution to the debate is in its rebuttal on the value or the capability of machine learning in and of itself. So the question in how you compare OO-CG is really about whether or not the amount of analysis that CG does to rebut OO is sufficient in actually taking out the premises of OO's case. So OO, for instance, does do a lot of work on like human capacity in comparison. So as a judge, you sort of need to decide whether how well the content of the CG responses clash or actually manage to damage OO case. Because CG's case does respond to a lot of OO, but the question is whether or not they actually do a lot of damage to the premises and the way-ups that OO sets up in the debate. In this instance, it is likely that you're going to feel like CG does a lot of engaging, but probably doesn't do as much damage as possible. Therefore, it is likely in the way-up that you will see OO doing better than CG does in the debate. In comparison, let's look at the long cross and CO and OG, which is maybe a bit more complicated to think about. So the first thing to recognize is that CO definitely does shut out OG and like sort of claims they fall out, refuses to take a POI from OG, sort of just like dismisses OG and boxes them out of the debate. This as a judge does not mean that we don't still weigh out what CO actually does with OG material and whether it truly clashes. So you as a judge still need to be able to evaluate what CO has done to OG's case, despite CO claiming that they don't have to. So there are maybe like two big things to consider here. One is the theoretical like BP rules part of it, right? That OG didn't get a chance to engage with CO and that CO has more time and therefore an explicit burden to respond directly to OG. But the other part of it is in application, looking at the theory versus things like CO's case does attempt to reframe the debate slightly on what the comparison is, for instance, on government duty. Therefore, it doesn't truly clash with the beginning frames that are set up in OG, but also what CO does is a lot more illustrative work and weighing that clashes, and all of that weighing does clash with the framing way up that OG already attempts to do at the start. Therefore, it is entirely possible to truly compare what CO does to what OG does, even though OG technically gets boxed out by CO in terms of POIs and in rebuttals. In that way up, it is likely that you are probably going to see that CO does do enough damage to the initial framing and way up that OG does, and that it is likely that you'll see CO take the debate over OG purely based on quality of response and quality of analysis, as opposed to like the BP rules version of comparing CO-OG. Of course, in like some other debates that you might see that entirely instances where the reason why CO wins over OG is because CO just does far more damage to OG setup and OG unfortunately loses out. But this is not one of those debates because OG does do a lot of preemptive work at the start and a lot of framing that is worth comparing and that is worth looking at and you can evaluate that content directly almost between OG and CO, especially with the framing of what this debate should be.
Perhaps just one thing to add, you might realize that even though CO never explicitly says they are dealing with OG, a lot of the material that responds to CG is actually material that responds to OG. They've merely packaged it as responding to CG, but since we flagged that a lot of what CG says ends up being a little bit derivative of what opening government says, the responses to closing government are also very, like, if you buy that the CO adequately responses to closing government claims that are derivative of opening government claims, then you must also buy that they respond similarly well to opening government claims that are the same. Okay, So I think this is it for us. Does anybody have any questions or comments or thoughts? I know that we've held you back already 20 minutes longer than we've actually meant to. So you know, if you guys just want to pop off now, that's fine. But if you want to stay and ask questions or clarify things, or even just give us your feedback, that would be, you know, nice too. We're happy to stay on.
Thank you very much.
Okay, no problem. Thank you for coming.
Okay, I guess if there are no more questions, then we shall wrap it up. Thank you, Enting, for doing most of the work for this lecture. And thank you, everyone. We'll see you, most of you at least, for Module 3 on next Saturday morning. That is the module where we will discuss chair panel dynamics, crafting OAs, how you make the final call, consensus decision making, all of those things, and then do the feedback session where we'll play a video and then you can submit your oral adjudications and we'll give you written feedback via email later. Yep, that's about it. Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thank you very much.